A bridge. For humans and mutants to connect. If he heard this sentence from other people, Stryker would only sneer at it and feel it was ridiculous. But he is facing Luke, a war hero who often creates miracles and has done many unthinkable things as the great Superman. The exact words, coming from different people, carry different weights. War hero, Superman, Allied savior, World War II ender, female warlock pile driver, the titles represent unparalleled prestige and status. Many people say that if Luke announces his candidacy for the next presidential election, he will take over the White House by a massive margin without any doubt. It's a pity that this major general is persistent and has no interest in becoming the youngest president in United States history. General, please forgive my short-sightedness, not being able to see the future that you envision. Stryker said, after thinking for a long time. He didn't think human beings must live in harmony with mutants. According to the primitive law of the jungle, wouldn't the simplest and most direct way be to eliminate them? Do you think it's easy to defeat mutants? Luke visited this vast and solid military base and whispered, as long as Congress allows you to mobilize armed troops, you can rush into their homes and arrest all these ticking time bombs. Put electric shock collars on their necks, throw them into metal cages, inject leech serum regularly, dissect, abuse, and conduct inhuman and cruel experiments just like livestock. Stryker was silent. He thought so. The concepts that Dr. Trask taught you might not necessarily be correct. Luke sneered. Of course, he knew that the dwarf scientist would prefer to use the mutant as a tool to create a sophisticated weapon. But what good can this do for oneself? Let the bald eagle rule the world. It would be more interesting to establish a Superman regime similar to the Third Reich. Your perception is limited by your mindset. Stryker, you have been with Dr. Trask for so long. Have you ever thought about the true question? Luke was thinking about how to use the military base while he was talking to Stryker. Where do mutants come from? Do they appear regularly? Must a child born between a mutant couple be a mutant? Or what are the circumstances under which mutants are more likely to be born? Stryker frowned and whispered, "Sorry, General, I don't know." Dr. Trask's current research is limited to the mapping of genetic profiles for the time being and hasn't reached that stage. Let me tell you something, Stryker. Luke stopped and opened the door of the control room. The damp, musty air poured in. There is no rule for the birth of a mutant. They are simply a divergence from the human species. Even bolder assumptions. Every person in the world may carry the X gene in their body. Once it's activated, then, will turn into a mutant. Do you have a girlfriend? Stryker was listening intently when he was caught off guard by one of the biggest headaches for singles. He shook his head and explained, "Cough, I'm from Arizona, where the culture is a bit more conservative." Stryker tried to save a single dog's last shred of dignity. Imagine if you were to get married and have lovable little children, but he or she is a mutant, what would you do? Luke's mouth quirked up in a smile. You want to put that cute little one in a cage too? Stryker had nothing to say. After a long while, he said, "I was wrong, General. You are the one who sees the farthest. You're the first to realize the contradiction between the two races and the essence of interdependence." At this moment, it can be said that the young general convinced him in front of him. What started as idolatry became firm devotion. Well, the visit is over. Tell Dr. Trask that I found him a better place to live. Luke gently touched the complex buttons on the console, and an idea came to mind. If Sebastian Shaw took the initiative to look for him and raided the dam base in Lake Alkali, could he directly open the floodgate and destroy this guy without effort? The talent of absorbing and transforming energy will not affect the face of a terrible water torrent like a tsunami. I hope Sebastian Shaw will take the initiative and deliver himself to my door. Luke chuckled lightly at the thought. Anna Maria Island, a waterfront hotel. Namor, who just joined the Hellfire Club, met his compatriots for the first time. Not only Sebastian Shaw, Emma Frost, the White Queen, but also various other mutants. This is Namor Mackenzie, the King of Atlantis and a leader worth following. Sebastian acted like a White House spokesman, introducing himself instead of Namor. In his view, Namor, who had just ascended the throne, was young and green. There is no charisma or leadership aura to speak of, but he could be a good tool nonetheless. But this is just what I wanted, an easy-to-control puppet. Sebastian smiled. His eyes flashed with pride. By virtue of Namor's identity as a mutant, he gradually approached the other party. After gaining trust, he began to manufacture violent conflicts between mutants and human beings that couldn't be reconciled. making Namor hostile towards human beings, and then striving to start a war between the underwater civilization and the people on land. This is his plan. As for being a hero who saved his kin, a leader who will lead the mutants to create a future, those were all false lies designed to coax a child. It's like when your parents put away those cash gifts for you during Christmas and say they'll return them to you later. If anything, mutants must have a leader. That will only be me. Sebastian Shaw thought so. The mutants have always been in a bad position. Humanity treats us as freaks, outsiders. They reject and persecute us. They don't want to admit that their ignorance, stupidity, and blindness cause all this. In the same way that they burned Giordano Bruno and sent the witches to the stake. Sebastian's voice was passionate. He was in full passionate public speaker mode. Because they are just a bunch of short-sighted, inferior creatures who are scared, panicked, and can't sleep at night once they find something they couldn't understand or accept. They must be completely stifled before they would stop. My fellow mutants, we are pioneers on the road of evolution, but now we are forced to hide like rats in a sewer. Is this fair? There was silence in the hotel suite, but everyone's faces were full of hatred, and their eyes were bursting with anger. You have to give it to Sebastian Shaw. His remarks are very provocative to mutants who have been treated unequally. Even Namor beside him was reminded of his painful childhood experiences, and anger filled his chest. Crack! A silver bolt of lightning struck down, tearing apart the thick dark clouds. At some point, the sea was surging with fury, as if echoing everyone's mood. Now, it's time to stand up and resist. Sebastian looked at Namor, who was standing tall, and said, "We have a new leader, and we are no longer scattered. If you want to be the leader of the mutants, you have to prove yourself." A young man in a suit and tie came forward. He is Riptide, with the natural ability to spin at high speed and create tornadoes. He belongs to the inner circle of Hellfire Club. I am not questioning you, Mr. Shaw, nor am I targeting Namor, our new brethren. Riptide, like an invited extra side character, shouted, "But the leadership position is not just a matter of choosing someone at random. At least we have to trust him enough, and he has to show his strength to convince everyone." Riptide, how can you talk to His Majesty Namor like this? He is the king of Atlantis and the master of the seven seas. Sebastian flew into a rage when he heard that, just as if he was the one questioned and insulted. His eyes were full of anger. This kind of reaction made Namor, who was preparing to express his opinions, secretly moved. He lacked family warmth from his parents since he was a child. Atlanteans killed his father, and his mother was afraid to stand up for herself due to the kingdom's traditions. Even the people who should have addressed Namor as Prince looked at him with strange eyes, regarded him as a freak, and wanted him expelled from Atlantis. Sebastian Shaw's support and approval simply surprised Namor. The young man, nicknamed Riptide, stuck his neck out and retorted defiantly, "Mr. Shaw, we all respect you. But it doesn't mean that you can just find someone to be a leader and get everyone's approval. Before that, we had never met Namor. We don't know what kind of ability he has. Do we have to obey just because he is the king of Atlantis? Does the Hellfire Club want to hand over the future of our compatriots to a stranger so easily?" Riptide has wholly entered the argumentative mode. His face is red, and the veins on his forehead were bursting out, like a hot-blooded young man who was thinking about his compatriots. Once these words were spoken, they drew a large chorus of agreement. Except for Sebastian Shaw, who remained silent, and Emma, the White Queen, everyone else agreed. Then, fierce quarrels and arguments came one after another. It's like a pre-rehearsed stage play, with some acting as the good guy and some as the bad guy. Sebastian acted as Namor's defender, while the mutants, led by Riptide, expressed their opposition, and the two sides were at odds. That's enough. Namor, who didn't even notice that it was all a ruse, stopped the crowd. He thought that Sebastian Shaw supported him and felt sympathy for the tragic fate of his compatriots. If the new king of Atlantis could calm down and think about it, he would have found many strange and odd things. Unfortunately, when impulsive emotions dominate the intellectual landscape, reason becomes useless and thrown to the back of the mind. Mr. Shaw, they are all very reasonable. Although we are both mutants, we have never been in contact with each other. We have no understanding of each other and no familiarity. Besides, as a new member, it would be inappropriate to take the leadership position. Namor graciously showed his understanding and continued, "My fellow compatriots, I am also a mutant. My natural ability is flying. In addition, I can breathe underwater and withstand the cold and pressure of the deep sea. I was 16 years old when I awakened my powers. At that time, I slipped and fell down the steps of the subway. I thought I would fall and get injured, but I didn't expect to see myself floating in the air as if I was free from gravity. Sebastian's eyes flickered, and he quietly noted the information. Then, he glared at the riptide and said, "Are you satisfied? Namor has shown his sincerity. He is really on the side of mutants, and he's also eager to save his suffering compatriots, which is exactly why the Hellfire Club was founded. Mr. Shaw, I would like to apologize to Namor Mackenzie." Riptide softened his attitude and sincerely said, "Namor, I hope you can forgive my rudeness just now. It was all out of caution. We are hiding in the darkness and have seen too many ugly, vile human beings." The ruse ended successfully. After quarreling and reconciliation, Namor had a strange sense of belonging to the Hellfire Club, as if he had integrated into it and was entirely accepted by his compatriots. In a deep voice, he said, "Human beings are always afraid of the unknown, then they raise their swords. I can understand your feelings. In those years, when I lived in Manhattan, I was often oppressed. After awakening my ability, I was regarded as a freak. I didn't find my true self until I returned to Atlantis, won the affirmation of my people, and succeeded the throne. So, I'm willing to do something for my compatriots. I have no intention of being the leader of the mutants, but we have all suffered so much and should unite." Namor is right. Sebastian took the time to interrupt. He will not give the other party a chance to build prestige and rally people's hearts. The Hellfire Club is a bargaining chip to grab power and status for him, so why would he let that brat, Namor, take the limelight? By the way, Riptide, why didn't Azazel, Satan, come? Sebastian changed the subject, frowned, and asked, "Today is a gathering day for the club. He shouldn't be absent." "Mr. Shaw, Azazel can't come." After receiving the prompt to enter the next scene of the play, Riptide looked sad and bowed his head. He was arrested by the military and put in prison. During this time, many compatriots were caught, and they suffered unimaginable terrible torture, becoming cold bodies on the operating table. The Hellfire Club's ability is limited, and it's impossible to fight against the government. Not to mention the one responsible for capturing the mutants is the youngest Major General of the Pentagon, the Superman who defeated the Axis. Sebastian glanced at Namor, who had accumulated anger, and added fuel, "It's Luke Cavill. I heard his name when I was in Europe. He's an ambitious and unscrupulous guy. The so-called war hero, allied Superman, is all false propaganda. Poor Azazel, he may be lying on the operating table now, enduring cruel human experiments." Namor is an impulsive character. When Sebastian said this, he couldn't help but clench his fists. His face turned as dark as the deepest parts of the sea. "Are we just going to sit back and do nothing while our compatriots are being hunted?" he asked indignantly. "Namor, you may not know. Luke Cavill isn't an ordinary man. He is a product of human military experiments. He is a legendary super soldier. He was once alone deep into the Axis, penetrating an army, and even a bomber group couldn't harm him." Sebastian sighed. The Hellfire Club alone can't cope with Superman, not to mention he is a major general of the military, leading the famous intelligence agency, S.H.I.E.L.D., with the support of the government. "I am the king of Atlantis." Namor's eyebrows raised, and his head held high, emitting a domineering aura. For him, a major general from the land's civilization was nothing. Sebastian's dissuasion didn't work but added fuel to the fire. That's what he wanted to see. "Luke Cavill. Superman. I will not stand by and watch my compatriots being slaughtered, arrested, and treated like livestock." Namor said in a loud voice. "Mr. Shaw, it's time for the Hellfire Club to take action. We can no longer hide ourselves and escape from reality. We should let the human world know what kind of power the mutants have." "But, how can we fight against Superman?" Sebastian asked hesitantly. "Humph, Superman, I'll take care of it." Namor crossed his arms to inform his chest and looked at the outside world through the French windows. The dark clouds, the silver lightning, and the roaring sea were like the curtains opening for Atlantis, welcoming it to the world stage. "I will show that guy that there are stronger fighters than him in this world." Time quietly advanced to November 1945, and the lively atmosphere before Thanksgiving became more and more intense. People began to prepare for the parade, and many supermarkets or shops planned price reduction activities and distributed coupons. New Yorkers were looking forward to gathering with family and friends soon to enjoy a turkey dinner. Well, it was a fierce battle. Luke woke up from bed contentedly, glanced at the clothes and high heels that fell on the floor, and couldn't help smiling. He went into the bathroom naked, washed, and threw on a robe. He opened the heavy curtains to welcome the morning sun and beautiful day. A calm New York City is a rare sight to see in the future. Luke stretched out and bathed in the warm sunlight. He had lived a relatively relaxed life recently, and the operations of S.H.I.E.L.D. were gradually getting on track and growing at a steady pace. The headquarters expanded from 3 departments to 8 departments. The number of spies, agents, operatives, and field teams was also increasing. All this was Carter's credit. He had to say that she's suitable for this job. Luke was able to get things in order without much effort. If we keep up this pace of development, we might soon be free from the constraints of the Pentagon and the White House. Luke thought with satisfaction. Recently, the 3 labs have also gained something. The nuclear fusion reactor proposed by Howard has created its latest model, waiting for the test results. Dr. Zola's idea of using Woden's blood to transform cells and improve energy absorption efficiency has achieved initial success. Maybe in another week, Luke will be able to receive the injection. As for the mutant genetic mapping project led by Bolivar, it's in progress. It's worth mentioning that Task Force X, led by Wolverine and Sabretooth, performed well. Acting as SHIELDs outside help several times, and helping the agents complete their missions has demonstrated outstanding results. So much so that the Pentagon generals, at every meeting, hinted at Luke to recruit more mutants as soon as possible. It is better to form a large enough army, put them into the overseas battlefield, attack in all 4 directions, and easily win. Toward this, the Major General was unmoved and pretended that he hadn't heard anything. These old guys who experienced World War I and World War II knew how to turn all available people or things into mass-produced assembly line weapons. But Luke has his ideas so that they won't influence him. It feels good to have a new house. He stood in front of the French windows, overlooking Manhattan at his feet. The constant flow of traffic. At the fantastic height of the 46th floor, there's a breathtaking view of half of the Upper East Side. Thanks to the enthusiastic sponsorship from Congress, Luke has enough money at hand. He bought a 48-story apartment building in Manhattan without even blinking. According to the real estate agent, this high-rise is called the Baxter Building, designed by a famous French architect with a high-end and upscale atmosphere. The only drawback is that it is expensive. This can be considered an investment for its future value. Luke muttered. Now, shortly after the end of World War II, the United States hasn't seen inflation yet. In the future, on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, where every inch of land is valuable, the cost of buying a high-rise building wouldn't be covered without owning billions. But what impressed Luke wasn't just the demand but also the fact that the Baxter Building is only 3 blocks away from the New York Sanctuary. It's safe to put Malina here. It's a ruse to make the Sorcerer Supreme a bodyguard. General, there's an emergency. Stryker's anxious voice came through the phone as if his house was on fire. What happened? Luke asked, frowning. It was the weekend. He wanted to have a slow breakfast, then go to Brooklyn to talk to Rogers. After catching up with old friends, they could go to their luxury yacht docked at the Hudson River port to bask in the sun and talk about their life ideals. Considering the integrity of Captain America and the paparazzi waiting outside, Luke gave up the idea of calling a group of models to have a party. That's Howard's style. Before the boring and tedious rich man's day could begin, a phone call from Stryker put a damper on the whole plan. What the hell happened? A tsunami? Luke shook his head, sighed, and said to Malina, who was still lying in bed, it looks like I have to go save the world. Tell Steve that the noon get-together is cancelled. Boom. As his voice fell, the tall and straight figure rose to the sky. A few minutes later, Luke appeared in S.H.I.E.L.D. headquarters. Stryker couldn't speak clearly on the phone, so he simply came over. What's the situation? What made you all look so frightened? Luke walked into the conference room. Carter, who was sitting on the left-hand side, looked solemn, and Howard looked severe. Stryker, who was still a follower, stayed quietly in the corner. In a word, the atmosphere is rather depressing. Maybe, the Kree came early? Luke narrowed his eyes and sat in the main seat. A horrible, diplomatic incident. Carter spat out these words. She turned on the heavy projector and projected the blurred black and white photos on the wall. A tsunami. Luke's eyebrows were frowning. The continuous flicker, which eventually formed a coherent picture, presented a wrecked scene after a disaster. Buildings were washed away, bridges collapsed, and the waves never overshot the land. This is Florida's Anna Maria Island, just yesterday. Local residents were hit by the tsunami, which is probably at a level 2 orange alert severity. Carter grimaced and explained, but that's not the point. Look at this. The female agent brought up a photo, an image of the gloomy sky, wind, rain, and a vague figure. His hands open, like a sorcerer casting a spell, manipulating the changes in the weather. The man claimed to be Namor Mackenzie, the king of Atlantis. Because the government arrested his compatriots, he artificially created the disaster. Carter's voice was a little low. She softly said, he sent a tape to S.H.I.E.L.D. and the FBI, admitting that the tsunami attack on Anna Maria Island was made by him alone. And said, if the military doesn't stop the brutality of catching mutants, the next city hit by the tsunami will be New York. Finally, Namor Mackenzie warned S.H.I.E.L.D. and, you, in the name of the King of Atlantis. Luke listened quietly, tapping his fingers on the table, his face unreadable. He didn't expect the one to take the lead in getting himself into trouble was Namor, the Sea King. The rip-off little prince reputation is true to his name. Before he provoked the other party, the guy came to the door himself. Has S.H.I.E.L.D. collected a lot of mutants recently? Luke asked subconsciously. Namor is a mutant. Yes, but why did he suddenly care about his compatriots? This guy is only interested in tearing people apart and picking on them, and he doesn't even care much about Atlantis people that much. Carter shook her head and replied, no, according to what you ordered, we always start from the school years and pay attention to the young students who have had unusual incidents. They are easier to control and don't resist as fiercely as the other mutants. All these things were done in a very low-key manner. When things go wrong, there must be a cause. Namor warned S.H.I.E.L.D. and him for no reason. There must be some other reason. After thinking for a few seconds, Luke spat out a name, Sebastian Shaw. The mad scientist who turned himself into a mutant? Howard asked with interest, stretching his legs. He isn't only the manager of Lab 1 but also the scientific research consultant in S.H.I.E.L.D. Howard has the right to vote in case of any significant problem that is difficult to decide on, provided that Luke and Carter are absent. I remember your story about him. Like the dwarf in Lab 3, Sebastian Shaw is obsessed with the mutant gene. The entire S.H.I.E.L.D. is aware that Howard and Bolivar don't get along. The former felt that Bolivar was not only a dwarf in stature but also lacking in knowledge. The latter believes that Howard is nothing but a hormonal, dirty mind. Every time the two met, they had to have a bit of a tit-for-tat, full of hostility. Initially, Luke wanted to reconcile, but considering that it would help stimulate their sense of competition, he dismissed the idea. The man calls himself the King of Atlantis, the Master of the Seven Seas. Would anyone give himself such a long list of titles? It's almost as long as a restaurant menu. Feeling Carter's cold eyes, Howard shrank his neck and realized that it wasn't the time to be smart and humorous. He coughed twice, glared at the gloating Luke, and continued. Namor Mackenzie is a mutant, so just give him a shot of leech serum. Wouldn't that work? It's not that simple, Howard, don't you get it? This is a diplomatic matter. Carter frowned, thinking about how to deal with it. Atlantis is an underwater civilization that human beings have never touched or known. Before Namor's appearance, people only heard of this from dialogues of Plato and the legend of Poseidon. But now? It appeared as a country and a civilization. This means that S.H.I.E.L.D. has to be careful and reconsider whatever decision we make. Congress, the White House, the Pentagon, no one wants a war right now. Therefore, we should negotiate, contact, and establish relations, which is what we should do. Carter deserves to be the commander. She had a thorough analysis of the problem. Luke pondered, if the tape of Namor's threatening speech had flowed into the White House, the president would have called him by now. After all, the other party deliberately said S.H.I.E.L.D. in his own name. A few minutes later, as he expected. General, a phone call from the White House. The phone on the desk rang. Stryker picked up the receiver and covered it with his hand. The president wants to see you. Luke, who guessed it, looked relaxed and said, I'll go to the White House in half an hour. He can answer questions from the president and Congress at any time. The urgent problem right now is to find Namor's whereabouts and stop his madness that could flood New York. The Sorcerer Supreme might not make a move. Millions of deaths in New York may not give the Ancient One much of a psychological impact. Kamar Taj is always a neutral bystander. The Black Death that ravaged Europe, World War I, where thousands of people died, and World War II, where the Third Reich made a comeback. If she wanted to prevent these disasters and wars in human history, the Sorcerer Supreme could make them disappear. Before, I ordered Task Force X to search the Hellfire Club's whereabouts. Any clues? Luke asked. Not yet, but I think Silver Fox might know something. Silver Fox, Kayla, is a mutant recruited by S.H.I.E.L.D. She is Emma's sister, the White Queen of the Hellfire Club, which Luke had known for a long time and told Carter. Then let's use her as a breach. Luke thought about it. If he could do it himself, he could use Constantine's, expert in deception, and fool the other party with some words. But he was sure that Namor would stand up and speak for mutants inexplicably and was ready to flood New York. Someone in secret drives all this, Sebastian Shaw, the main suspect. Kong the Conqueror is also possible, but according to this guy's style of doing things and his usual routine, he would be pretending to be a historical figure and a national leader. Secretly stirring up problems, but also involving mutants, Sebastian Shaw was more suspicious. Let's disperse. I'll deal with the president. As for Namor Mackenzie, I will try to find him. Luke waved and smiled confidently. As the director, if he behaved calmly, the people under his command wouldn't feel pressured. Namor, Atlantis' stronghold is in the Atlantic Ocean. Luke recalled the information in his mind, and he remembered that the guy had the sacred trident of Neptune, which was the symbol of Atlantis' kingship. It can manipulate the sea, raise the waves, create a tsunami, and release electricity. It can be said to be an artifact-level weapon. With the Horn of Proteus calling for marine life, Namor's combat power should rank among the top 10 on Earth. Who told a gang of superheroes to be still infants or not born yet? We'll take it one step at a time, but with Namor's personality, it's impossible to hide. Luke got up and flew to the White House after finalizing his rough plan. Unlike the image of Sea King in the studio next door, in Marvel, he is more like a villain, with a moody personality and temperament. To sum up, it's a Chunibyo syndrome with an easy-to-manipulate personality. White House, lawn. The upright figure dropped rapidly like a cannonball. Dong. When landing, Luke turned on his bioforce field, causing no damage except for some noise. General Cavill, the president is waiting for you in the office. The White House security chief is used to the way Luke shows up. The no-fly zone was in vain for this young man, and no one could stop him anyway. Many old-school generals who have opinions about this only dared to talk behind his back and keep silent when facing him. A few minutes later, Luke walked into the Oval Office and met the president with a solemn expression. Major General Cavill, do you have anything to say about Atlantis and the mutant who started the tsunami? The president took off his glasses, pinched his nose, and wearily said, the Pentagon is going crazy. Admiral Bullock and Admiral Richardson of the Naval Forces have called. The two carriers in the Atlantic have been attacked, but fortunately, there are no casualties. Mr. Hoover, of the FBI, played me a tape a few hours ago in which a mutant named Namor Mackenzie confessed to doing this and threatened us with flooding New York, if we don't do as he says. The president looked at Luke, who was expressionless, and asked in a heavy voice, Major General, I could have had a happy weekend and had dinner with my wife and daughter, but now I have to face all these troubles. I hope you can give me a satisfactory answer. Mr. President is blaming me? Luke raised his head slightly and asked calmly. At the end of the sentence, the atmosphere in the Oval Office suddenly became heavy. The staffer sitting on one side had gulped. He wasn't sure whether he could protect the president if Major General Cavill went on the rampage. Major General, you misunderstood. Feeling the changing atmosphere in the Oval Office, the president put on his glasses again, just like a master of disguise, instantly changing faces. He put on a gentle smile. I just got carried away by the bad news. I didn't mean to blame you. S.H.I.E.L.D. is responsible for the shelter and control of mutants. Now that there's such a big mess, it's reasonable to answer those generals in the Pentagon. Similar words were spoken in a softer tone this time. No one could hear any half-hearted complaint, but more like a friendly discussion. The art of language is a fundamental skill for politicians. With all due respect, generals in the Pentagon should be more poised. Maintaining a high level of vigilance and preparing to plan for war is what they need to do. Not act like a frightened, chattering coward who appears to be asking the White House for everything. Luke wasted no time in accusing the old guys rudely. The president was shocked when he heard it. If this spread, the contradiction between the Naval Department and the Army Department would intensify again. At that time, he was still the one to get a headache. Major General Cavill, we put these questions aside for the time being, said the president, covering his face. Let's talk about Atlantis. Where are they really from? The president changed the subject. He didn't forget that the young Major General standing in front of him was only 20 years old. It was the impulsiveness of age, being unruly and frivolous. As the saying goes, politicians prefer to deal with politicians because there were default rules between them. But when it came to young people like Luke, it was a headache. He may not abide by the explicit rules of the political game and may overturn the table on impulse. In addition, the other party once flew to Berlin to end the war. The strongest super soldier of the military, the designated Superman of the Allies, and many other glorious things. Not to mention the Pentagon, even the White House had to give some respect. In Eisenhower's words, "How can we restrain a walking atomic bomb and put it in a cage? Don't worry, Mr. President, we are not ignorant of Atlantis." Luke pulled out his chair and sat down, showing a relaxed expression, as if this was no problem for him. Atlantis is an ancient civilization. They existed together with the Lemurian civilization on Earth, thousands of years ago, but they were sunk in the flood of extinction. Perhaps it was because the Atlanteans, as the people of the gods of the sea, had a strong reverence for the sea. They didn't die out but miraculously preserved the flame of civilization and began to carry on their legacy in the deep waters of the Atlantic Ocean. In the past century, many archaeologists have found the remains of prehistoric civilization near the Atlantic Ocean. Luke's eloquent language showed the attitude of, "I know Atlantis better than anyone else," which made the President and Chief of Staff in the office secretly admire him. Most of this information came from the residual memory deep in his mind. About the real history of Atlantis, we have to start with the group of Celestials. The universe bosses came to Earth for the second time. The first time was 4 billion years ago. They transformed some primitive humans, from which modern mutants evolved. Those primitive humans transformed by the Celestials are divided into 3 camps: the Eternals, the Deviants, and the Humans. Eternal beings are new gods, who study the absorption and transformation of cosmic energy, and have a long life, seldom getting old or dying. They once established 3 cities on the Earth: the Polaria city in Siberia, the underwater city Oceania, the Pacific Ocean, and Olympia in Greece, where they once were regarded as gods by the Greeks. After several migrations, there was a conflict in the middle. Zuruz, the leader of the Eternals, exiled his brother Alars to space. The latter is Thanos' father. He relied on his natural ability and vitality to rebuild his home on Titanos and form the Eternal race. If we go back to our roots and investigate our family tree, we can see that human beings on Earth are more or less related to Thanos. As for the opposite of the Eternals are the Deviants. They built cities on land, developed genetic engineering, took Lemuria as the capital, attempted to dominate the whole planet, and formed Lemuria's civilization, which existed simultaneously as Atlantis. Deviants have a high probability of gene mutation, and their offspring have no similarities with their parents. The only thing they have in common is that they were different from each other. Deviants have intense hostility towards all species, which also led to the aggression of the Lemurian civilization and provoked many enemies. They ushered in destruction in 16,000 BC. The Celestials descended to Earth for the second time, destroying Lemuria, the capital of Deviants. At the same time, the continental plate moved. Atlantis was affected and sank into the Atlantic Ocean. This incredibly ancient history is probably only preserved in a few words in Kamar Taj. Luke didn't bother to say much, so he just skipped the front and got down to business. Namor Mackenzie is the new king of Atlantis and a mutant at the same time. The rejection and persecution of mutants by humans have made him harbor hatred in his heart, wanting revenge. The president looked solemn and asked softly, "S.H.I.E.L.D. knew the existence of Atlantis long ago. Why didn't you report it?" "Because we had no conclusive evidence. How could we convince the Pentagon and members of Congress that an ancient civilization of tens of thousands of years was hiding in the depths of the Atlantic Ocean?" Luke shrugged his shoulders and pouted, "Mr. President, you didn't forget how the generals reacted when Dr. Trask first told them about mutants, right? Everyone's face was full of contempt and disdain, and Director Hoover of the FBI even laughed out loud. He said that it was just a clumsy lie invented by S.H.I.E.L.D. to defraud research funds. So sometimes, weakness and ignorance aren't the obstacles on the road to survival, but arrogance is." The president's face showed a trace of embarrassment. He coughed twice and selectively ignored the bitter satire on Director Hoover. He knew that the FBI and S.H.I.E.L.D. had never been on good terms, especially the relationship between the two directors. Edgar Hoover is a man who bears grudges. This wasn't a good thing for Luke, who's youthful and unruly. "Major General Cavill, since S.H.I.E.L.D. knows something about Atlantis, have you made a plan to deal with it?" The chief of staff, who listened silently, asked a timely question. As far as the current situation is concerned, no one wants another war. Once the sea civilization and the land world create a fierce conflict that can't be solved, it will probably turn into the beginning of World War III. Luke remained calm and calmly replied, "War will not come. This is my guarantee to all of you." Although Namor Mackenzie is a king, his pedigree isn't pure, and he was never fully recognized by the Atlanteans. It's not that simple to set off a war between two civilizations. His speech on that tape was more of a threat to force the military to give in. The president pondered for a long time and thought Luke had a point. The Pentagon and the White House were mainly frightened by the sudden emergence of Atlantis and the tsunami that hit Anna Maria Island. Human beings often think they know enough about the world, but in fact, the planet beneath their feet didn't only belong to them. "Mr. President, tell the Pentagon generals that New York will not fall." Luke had told him the story of Atlantis, Sebastian Shaw, and the Hellfire Club. After a while, he stood up and looked down at the president who was still sitting in the chair. "Because I will go to Atlantis myself and show the Atlanteans that the land is far less fragile than they think." As the helicopter slowly lifted off, Luke put on his sunglasses and sat in the cockpit, overlooking the shrinking White House. He would have preferred to fly over, but he chose to abandon it. Considering his overly aggressive appearance, he might be mistaken as a hostile attack by the Atlantic Fleet and cause unnecessary panic. Think of it as a rest period after the 500 meters sprint. The Major General thought so. Just now, in the Oval Office, what the President and the Pentagon meant was that they wanted SHIELD to compromise temporarily and suspend the mutant housing program. This will buy more time for the Pentagon to contact Atlantis. Luke can see that both the White House and the military were interested in learning about a marine civilization that has existed for thousands of years. It's like two hunters in a jungle, always studying each other before shooting. Atlantis' strength is much stronger than that of the US. It was unrealistic to expect them to be treated as indigenous people. The corners of Luke's mouth tugged in a sarcastic smile. When the Pilgrims arrived in the New World, they began with the idea of living in peace with the indigenous people. But later, when a large number of immigrants arrived and the living space was crammed, and the conflict between the two sides ignited like a barrel of gunpowder, and it exploded instantly. Today's indigenous people have already lost their land, culture, and religious beliefs. For the top brass of the federal government, they wanted to repeat history. Confirm whether Atlantis is hostile, then confirm whether their technological level is backward or advanced. This is related to the strategy to be adopted later, whether it is war or diplomacy. The president and generals didn't want to fight, not because they are pacifists. Instead, there was no benefit in opening a war so rashly. But, what does this have to do with me? Luke doesn't want to look at the big picture. He doesn't have to sacrifice for the White House and the military. The mutants are good cards to play and can be helpful in the future. It doesn't make sense that Namor would just give a couple of warnings, then later, would obey orders honestly. No matter how mighty Atlantis is, can it be compared with the future overlord of the universe, the three galactic empires? It's kind of like two kids fighting over each other's toys. Luke smiled to himself when he noticed the slightest hint of displeasure within. He knew that the Pentagon wasn't calling the White House to get the president to develop a solution. The real purpose of the guys from the Navy Department was to put pressure on him. Or, more accurately, to see Superman make a fool of himself. How does a powerful Major General face a threat and warning of an unknown civilization? If he were too tough, he would bear the responsibility of provoking a war. Being too weak means losing the country's dignity, and it will cast a shadow over Superman's dazzling aura. This was a difficult multiple-choice question. Unfortunately, only children make choices. Luke smiled, took out a first-generation product promoted by Skynet, a brick-sized mobile phone, and dialed a number. This thing hasn't been put on the market for the time being. It is only used as a military product, provided to the various military bases and government agencies. Its civilian use will probably have to be delayed for a while. However, the promotion work by Stark Industries was already in full swing. Howard is a fast learner and has absorbed Luke's usual business concepts such as speculative hype and market prep. Advertisements such as, the only thing that will change the way of communication in the future, the first choice for families with cars and a must-have for people at the cutting edge of technology, and so on, continuously bombarded people with marketing slogans. Completely packed, this stupid, big, black, and thick mobile phone is a high-end item that only successful people and elites could afford, as if owning it would significantly enhance their status. He had to say, the hype gimmick and false packaging tactics were very useful in any era. Luke considers whether or not to make persistent efforts to develop such methods as hunger marketing and fake reviews. Turning Skynet's mobile phones as the light of the country and the cutting edge of technology. I must have chosen the wrong plotline. The Major General shook his head, restrained his thinking, and said to Colonel Phillips on the other end of the phone, "I'm going to the 2nd Atlantic Fleet. Are you familiar with General Ingram?" "You know? That's great. Tell him that I need the temporary command of the 2nd Fleet. The White House is still in the middle of a meeting, so there's no time to give orders. You call Nimitz and ask him for a favor." Although the relationship between the Naval Department and the War Department has always been bad, we are all acquaintances, so there is no need to make things awkward. A few minutes later, Luke hung up. Before searching for Wolverine, MacArthur, who took charge of the supreme command of Allied powers in Japan, gave generous support. Now it was the time to ask for the temporary command of the 2nd Fleet, and he wondered if Chester Nimitz would show kindness to him. The other party is now the Chief of Naval Operations. The Atlantic Fleet participated in the Sicily landing campaign. He and Luke had a chance to meet at that time. Later, when they returned to New York, they also attended the commendation banquet together. It's a pity that the current president isn't Roosevelt, who was more interested in nuclear weapons. Luke thought silently. Bordered by the Atlantic Ocean to the east and the Pacific Ocean to the west, the United States is a traditional maritime power. This is also why the Navy had a special status and could become the #1 military branch in the future. At the end of the 19th century, the United States naval and military experts put forward the theory of sea power, which advocated establishing an offshore naval fleet and the mastery of the sea. They would build overseas bases and gain world hegemony. This strategy was widely accepted, and since then, the Navy started to build battleships of over 10,000 tons and entered an unprecedented stage of accelerated development. In particular, when Roosevelt was in power, he was determined to build a first-class naval fleet, and set the fantastic goal of catching up with Britain and becoming the first in the world. A few years later, the Atlantic Fleet was formally established and went through 2 world wars. It had 1.5 million troops, nearly 20,000 ships, and more than 10,000 aircraft at its peak. So, it's no wonder that the Army Department's people have been acting all day strangely, and frankly, it's just feeling sour. After all, they aren't as glamorous. Luke recalled that every time there was a meeting, many generals from the 2 factions of the Pentagon went head-to-head. The scene was no different from the Irish mob fighting over territory. The former only talks about national interests and military strategy, while the latter is about insurance coverage and street division. In fact, I'm now in the Army faction. Nimitz wouldn't necessarily show politeness. Luke crossed his fingers, thinking that the plan would have to be slightly changed if the Atlantic Fleet didn't cooperate. At the end of World War II, when Japan surrendered, President Harry Truman wanted MacArthur, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Army, to officiate at the surrender ceremony and sign as a representative of the Allies. This proposal immediately aroused the intense dissatisfaction of the Navy's leading officer, Nimitz, who even publicly said that he refused to attend. The fierce and apparent opposition forced the president to withdraw the proposal and come out to comfort. Later, they placed the signing ceremony on the battleship. After that time, the dispute over land and sea powers in the United States was basically out in the open. The top generals from both sides of the faction saw each other in an unfavorable light. SHIELD, which is under the Army's leadership, provoked Atlantis and caused the loss of 2 Navy carriers. Luke mulled it over for a while, estimating that several Navy Department bigwigs would like to see him eat a loss. I'm not even a part of it, just an innocent observer. SHIELD will be positioned as a large organization responsible for maintaining world peace, contacting and communicating with extraterrestrial civilizations in the future. It doesn't belong to the naval faction or the army faction at all. Idiotic disputes. What does it have to do with my SHIELD? Luke grimaced, thinking that he could take this opportunity to separate SHIELD from the Pentagon and save himself from being pulled back and forth and forced aside with one. General, we have arrived at the 2nd Fleet. Hearing the pilot's reminder, Luke looked up. The aircraft carrier of the 2nd Fleet quietly creeps on the surface of the sea. Major General Cavill, I have received orders from General Nimitz. Now, the fleet is all yours. The helicopter landed on the empty deck, and Captain Bullock of the Second Fleet walked up against the strong winds from the propellers. The Navy's chief of operations didn't disrespect Superman. Even if the other party belonged to the Army Department, it was an excellent opportunity to make trouble. Show respect can be my mantra from now on. Luke took off his sunglasses and was satisfied with his relationships. This is also a manifestation of charisma. The two carriers raided by the Atlanteans yesterday were the USS Lincoln and the USS Stennis. After receiving the order, Captain Bullock cooperated with Luke's inquiry. According to the sailor's report, it was at 4:20 p.m. The weather on the sea suddenly became terrible. Lightning and thunder, dark clouds swept over, raising tens of meters of waves. Luke narrowed his eyes. This kind of appearance that creates a wave of ambiance and builds up the effect could be very Namor. This is similar to the scene when Magneto shows up. He can lose in a fight, but the momentum wasn't destructive. They all belong to the expensive special effects category. Then a man came on deck, claiming to be the king of Atlantis, and said a bunch of nonsense that he didn't hear clearly. Captain Bullock scratched his head. At that time, the wind was blowing, and the sailors were busy taking the aircraft on the deck back to the hangar, so they ignored it. Then, the man got angry, and a group of tall soldiers with blue skin appeared from underwater. Their weapons were more advanced than ours. They could emit light and freeze people into ice. And our carbine bullets couldn't penetrate their armor. Luke nodded. Atlantis is ahead of the current Earth in science and technology, at least for this era. However, although it is a high-tech civilization, the government system is almost as backward as Wakanda's, with a clear-cut hierarchy. The criteria for choosing a king are, first of all, pedigree, followed by strength. If not for the small number of royalty in Atlantis and even fewer direct bloodlines, it might not have been Namor's turn, as he is a half-blood. The Atlanteans quickly took control of the two aircraft carriers. Many sailors tried to resist but to no avail. The first man who went on deck, his name was Namor Mackenzie. He was simply like a super soldier. He had immense strength. Captain Bullock thought back to the sailors' horrified expressions and couldn't help but glance at Luke. The young Major General was a super soldier and the best one at that. He paused and continued. The man threw a bomber into the sea with his bare hands and destroyed the rest of the aircraft and the engines of the two aircraft carriers with a trident. As a result, the USS Lincoln and USS Stennis are still stranded on the surface and can't return to the shipyard for repairs. Luke waved his hand, indicating that it was a trivial matter, and lightly said, "Captain Bullock, I will bring back the two carriers later." An aircraft carrier is about tens of thousands of tons, so it may be a little challenging to carry it, but it wasn't a big problem to push it back as a human tugboat. Luke's current peak strength is about 500 tons. With full efforts, it can reach 1,000 tons. And this wasn't the limit. Theoretically speaking, he grows every day. The incredible physical data once broke Howard, who tested him. He couldn't imagine that human beings could evolve to such an extent. Luke always remembered the shocked look in Iron Man's father's eyes. He then said to him, "You must have lived a tough life, doing everything carefully for fear of damaging those concrete walls and buildings supported by reinforced concrete." However, he quickly broke Howard's imagination and replied, "No, the bioforce field covers everything." Then the conversation was over. "Thank you very much, Major General Cavill." Captain Bullock's eyebrows were knitted together. He was a little confused. Does the young Major General standing in front of him know how to fix aircraft carrier engines? Or is the other party prepared to fly directly to the dockyard and bring back a repair team for them? Even if he broke his brain from thinking, this captain wouldn't be able to guess that Luke was taking a more simple and straightforward approach. "Captain, how many carriers are still available in the Second Fleet?" Luke stood on the deck and instantly became the center of attention. Sailors and pilots who heard the news stared at him with admiration and awe. "There are 3 ships that can be put into service immediately," Captain Bullock said hesitantly. He didn't know what Luke wanted to do, but easily giving the aircraft carrier combat power to an Army Major General would always feel too risky. If Chester Nimitz, who is the leader of the Navy Department, hadn't called the captain, who is known for his reliability, he wouldn't have handed over the command. "That's good. Then you ordered them to drop torpedoes on the target, the sea in the Strait of Gibraltar." Luke's eyes flashed, determined to give Namor a good payback. Bombing with torpedoes is probably igniting detonators in front of Atlantis' door. Maybe it won't hurt the huge city located at the bottom of the sea, but it will undoubtedly disturb Namor, who had a bit of a temper. Torpedo? Captain Bullock was a little confused. Would this be effective? Don't those Atlanteans live on that sea's floor? So, torpedoes shouldn't be a threat to them. Luke didn't say much but smiled confidently. The plan has to be implemented to determine whether it would work or not. Atlantis, Poseidonia. This is the center of the four oceans, the most sacred place for marine life. The magnificent city stands at the bottom of the sea, retaining the mysterious aura of an ancient civilization. The magnificent square dome is supported by large stone pillars standing tall. Many blue-skinned Atlanteans, riding on seahorses or shuttles, form a gorgeous ribbon of light around the capital. Under the deep sea, it wasn't as dark and cold as people thought. Those colorful algae, or giant jellyfish, exude charming light and reflected dreamy colors. All these things remained unseen by humans. Through the vast film of water that enveloped Poseidonia, one enters the center of the city. You can see a magnificent palace and many armed guards patrolling back and forth. Powerful high-pressure water cannons were set up at various posts. Once an outsider breaks in, he will be met with the fiercest possible firepower. In the council chamber of the palace, Namor, holding a trident, leaned back on his throne. His eyebrows were tightly twisted into a frown. His face revealed negative emotions such as irritability and impatience. The many robed nobles standing at the bottom are none other than the elders of Atlantis. They repeated the same boring rules repeatedly, and Namor, on the throne, could almost smell the rotten stench. It was ridiculous that an ancient civilization that has been passed down for tens of thousands of years still held on to the rules and regulations set by its ancestors. Thinking about the evolution that Mr. Shaw spoke of, Namor looked at the Council of Elders with an even more annoyed look. Your Majesty, we shouldn't communicate with the land world, not to mention in a terrible way that might start a war. An elderly Atlantean nobleman in robes looked distressed as if Namor had done something treacherous. Atlantis has long adhered to the tradition of seclusion and closure. Only in this way could we better preserve ourselves and avoid unnecessary troubles. But, Your Majesty, you took the initiative to expose the existence of Atlantis to some mutants. Even threatening war. Do you want to get your people involved in a war for a bunch of outsiders who have nothing to do with Atlantis, Your Majesty? Namor grunted heavily and loudly said, Will Atlantis loses to the land world? We have far more technological power than they do and occupy 70% of the planet's territory. Why are the Atlanteans hiding? We are more powerful than the land people, and it is they who should be afraid and bow down to us. There was an outcry from the robed nobles, who began to accuse Namor of being a madman without regard for the etiquette between monarchs and subjects. Since Atlantis sank into the Atlantic Ocean, they rarely set foot on land. On the one hand, being out of the water for too long can make Atlanteans feel very sick and even show symptoms of fainting. On the other hand, the great disaster of the continental plate shift left a deep psychological fear in them. We don't need to plunder the land's territory and resources at all. War is pointless, Your Majesty. The robed nobleman admonished. Of course, it has a point. Let the people of the land know we exist, understand our strength, and worship Atlantis as a nation of gods. Isn't that enough? Namor's mouth picked up a cruel smile. He thought Mr. Shaw was right. The process of evolving was always accompanied by slaughter and annihilation. Survival of the fittest, this is the law of nature. Your Majesty, the robed nobleman wanted to say something else, but he heard a continuous explosion. Namor, who had better hearing, frowned, and with a slight push of his legs, like a sharp arrow, rushed straight out of the palace. He didn't want to listen to a bunch of old guys for a long time, so he just took the opportunity to leave. Breaking through the vast film of water that protects and hides the city, Namor made his way up. The explosion became more apparent, and the turbulent water flow formed tiny swirls of different sizes. Damn land people! Namor's anger surged up as he saw fish carcasses floating on the surface. Boom! Swinging his leg, he accelerated in an instant. Namor, holding a trident, broke the surface of the water and stood in mid-air like a god. I've been waiting for you for a long time. Before Namor figured out the situation and vented his anger, a deep voice full of mockery sounded like thunder. Boom! The atmosphere shook with an ear-splitting bang. Namor's pupils contracted, condensed into a needlepoint, capturing the instantaneous arrival of a tall figure. One moment the other party is still standing on the deck. The next second, like a supersonic aircraft, a boom makes a sound of tearing the air. Boom! Poor Namor had just broken the surface of the water when he was smashed in the face with a powerful swinging punch. He has never felt this way since he awakened his natural abilities and the Atlantean bloodline features in his body came to the surface. Pain. Numb. As if countless barrels of explosives burst open, a mouthful of blood mixed with teeth, thrown out in a beautiful arc. Namor himself was like a cannonball, hitting the sea with a fantastic splash and making a big wave. Angry, Namor forgot the pain and tried to spit out a few nasty words when the tall figure approached again. The air surged. Luke arrived in an instant, wearing a steel armor suit. He saw his hands clenched into a fist, like a heavy hammer. The hammer slammed down. The sticky wave of air was so loud that it seemed to pierce the eardrums. On the chaotic sea, a water column ruptured as high as 10 meters. The beaten Namor was pushed down in a straight line, sinking into the deep sea and disappearing. Phew. I feel much better. Luke, who was standing in midair, rubbed his fist with a smile at the corner of his mouth. He didn't have any habit of starting a fight right after greeting. No matter who the enemy is, beat them up before talking. On the deck of the aircraft carrier, Captain Bullock's eyelids twitched. Even he, who is known for his composure, can't help but show a shocked expression of, is he still human? Superman's reputation is well known, and everyone has heard of his many exploits. For example, one man fights hundreds of Aryan demons alone in Paris, flies to Berlin, ends the war, and so on. But, listening to people and seeing with his own eyes were two different things. At least Captain Bullock was still shocked when he saw Luke, who shot out from the ship like a supersonic aircraft and knocked Namor into the sea with one punch. I finally understand why General Nimitz should give an army major general some respect. The captain said with a bitter smile. If the Navy Department is a giant aircraft carrier, then the Army Department is a Gundam with Luke's presence. Brock did not doubt that he could dismantle an aircraft carrier with his bare hands. That's Superman. He's like a fighter plane. Good heavens. The super soldier. Do you think Captain America is that strong? Should be. I often read his comics. He beat up Hitler so many times. Sailors and pilots watched the battlefield from a distance while discussing Superman and Captain America's combat power with great interest. They are veterans who have experienced World War II and have seen the big show. But this was the first time for them to see in person this kind of explosive scene where Superman was fighting. Namor, that's the bastard's name, right? I think he's dead. Who can withstand a punch like that? Major General Cavill's punch could have pierced an aircraft carrier. I'll bet you $5 and a week of deck cleaning that guy's not dead. He hasn't even taken out his trident yet. A group of popcorn eaters was chatting when they noticed that the sky was getting dark. Large dark clouds covered the clear sky, and the calm sea seemed to rage, rolling up the turbulent waves. Boom. A figure broke through the sea surface. Namor is back. You damn land people. I'll kill you. With a swollen nose and a swollen face, Namor is holding Neptune's trident, and a blue electric current, like a small snake, lingered around his right arm. The muscles on his strong arms swelled, revealing terrible strength. At this moment, he seems to be the ruler of the seas. His anger affected the sea. Dark clouds piled up, lightning and thunder surged, and the day was dark as night. The carrier, which is quite deep in the water, was pushed by wave after wave and began to sway. Can you spare me those boring monologues? Luke curled his lips and scorned Namor, who lacked words. He watched as several massive tornadoes rose abruptly, pulling the water with terrifying force. Like a doomsday scene, as if the heavens and earth were collapsing, the audience watched. As the king of Atlantis, Namor did have the power to flood New York. This guy has home advantage. Luke is thinking, as an Atlantean, Namor is very different in the sea and on land. After setting foot on land, he must be exposed to water from time to survive. If not, the physical quality and ability will gradually decline and degenerate into an ordinary person. If dehydration lasts longer than 7 days, it may kill him. But the problem is that Namor couldn't stay in Atlantis forever. Because he is a hybrid with normal human and Atlantean genes. Double the physical characteristics, double the fun. Therefore, staying in the water or anywhere on land for too long may cause an imbalance of oxygen supply and demand in Namor, resulting in emotional mania and extreme rage. This is why he often goes looking for trouble and fights with superheroes and makes enemies, which is why he is known as the Little Prince. Generally speaking, his head wasn't screwed on the right, especially when he lacked water. You're Superman. Humph. People on land regard you as a war hero and super soldier, they'll soon learn they're wrong. Namor gripped Neptune's trident and mobilized its power. Dazzling lightning blasted out in a straight line. The condensed crystal water droplets evaporated in a few moments, leaving only a faint scorching smell. Since ancient times, your side has always lost. Luke's eyes stared, slightly glowing. The yellow sun energy surging in his body turned into a crimson light. Boom! The lighting and heat vision collided violently, sending out a powerful wave of air. Namor's tall body, standing steadily in midair, suddenly shook. He couldn't help retreating. His forehead was bursting with veins. He grasped the trident and thrust it forward. The dazzling electric light changed from something like a boa constrictor to a roaring dragon. No matter how hard you try, it's impossible to fight against losing fate. Luke was talking calmly, but his heat vision didn't let up. He is physically stronger than Namor, who can lift hundreds of tons of weight at most. Even if Namor had home advantage, it was limited. Boom! There was a heavy stomp, creating a heavy burst of air. Instead of retreating, Luke moved forward. The high-temperature energy that could evaporate flesh and blood, like a sharp sword, penetrated forward and directly knocked down Namor, who held the trident toward the air. Silvery white electric light, like winding cracks, struck the dark sky. Namor was thrown into the sea again, with resentment written all over his face. With his defeat, the raging storm and the accumulation of torrential rain seemed to be stagnant. Luke tore through the massive tornado. His right arm swung out. Thousands of tons of power condensed into a single point, breaking the majestic current of the high-speed rotation. Namor, who broke through the surface of the sea, looked as if he was torn apart. He couldn't even hold the exclusive weapon of the King of Atlantis, Neptune's trident. This guy is strong. The arrogant Namor finally came to his senses. Clutching his trident in both hands, a strong sense of defiance rose in his eyes. He is the King of Atlantis, and this battle is sure to be an important one. I must not lose. Atlantis was conservative, rarely communicating with the outside world, and resisted new things. Especially things from the land world. What soda water, popcorn movies, all contraband. They think it corrupts people's minds and has no value whatsoever. This is one of the reasons why the system and traditions they uphold seem to be relatively backward. The set of rules that have been passed down for thousands of years will always be out of date. No matter how powerful civilization is, it will be weakened sooner or later if it's self-enclosed for too long. Wakanda is the most obvious example. As one of the most technologically advanced countries on the planet, they chose their leaders not by popular vote or by parliamentary judgment but by a brutal and straightforward challenge. Is it impossible to say that a Wakandan who couldn't fight couldn't be a qualified king? There is no connection between personal strength and one's own ability. Through this, we can see that the long isolation allowed the Wakanda people, who were sitting on vibranium veins and didn't have to worry about developing resources, to remain in the tribal period in terms of their knowledge of governing. Namor, who grew up in a slum and went to live on land, hated the rules and regulations of Atlantis. In his view, a nation that judged superiority and inferiority by clothing and lineage was essentially no different from the slavery dynasties in history books. Backward, brutal, ignorant of progress. When Namor became king, he wanted to lead his people into the future, abolish ancient traditions, and make Atlantis great again. Unfortunately, the noblemen of the Council of Elders constantly interfered and obstructed him. I will pass Neptune's test and prove my bravery. At that time, no one will oppose my opinion. Namor raised the trident, and the dazzling surrounded his whole body, like wearing mighty armor. His low momentum rose again. Thunder rumbled through the dark clouds, emitting an ear-splitting roar. I will once again prove to the people of Atlantis that the king is powerful. Namor seemed to hear the warm cheers from Poseidonia, the capital of Atlantis. That was a chant for the warriors. Blue-skinned Atlanteans respected the strong and believed that only brave warriors could conquer the ocean and gain the gods' favor. This was also part of why Namor was able to rise to the throne above all others. Otherwise, the mere fact that his bloodline wasn't pure and that his skin color differed significantly from his people would have wholly disqualified him from competing for the throne. The black people in Wakanda would never choose a white person as king unless royal blood flowed in him. From a genetic point of view, the probability is minimal. He can fly and is more powerful than me. The only way to gain victory is to summon a more powerful helper. Namor, who accepted the defeat, took out another artifact belonging to the king. Horn of Proteus. This heavy horn wrapped in pure white gold ornaments can summon ancient creatures deep in the ocean. Whiroo! Whiroo! Loud and desolate trumpets resounded through the sea. The invisible waves spread out, releasing some kind of unique signal that immediately woke up the vast sea monster sleeping in the deep sea. Whoosh! 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 In the Atlantic Ocean, giant tentacles, tens of meters long, set off huge waves. It's the Kraken. Deep in Poseidonia Palace, the capital of Atlantis, the nobles were watching the battle. It seems that Namor has been driven to desperation by the land dweller. He didn't hesitate to use the Horn of Proteus to awaken the sleeping Kraken. Every time the Kraken wakes up, it would look for food. We'll have to prepare for another sacrifice day. Humph! Not even a land dweller could beat it. This is the great king of Atlantis, our noble-hearted king. The robed nobleman deliberated and continued to watch the battle through a mirrored layer of water. Kraken, also known as the deep-sea monster, is a giant sea monster that dwells off the coasts of Greenland. Typically lurking at the bottom of the deep sea, it will occasionally come to the surface to attack passing ships and prey on large marine animals such as whales. Many sailors used the Kraken's body as a small island to rest and lived on in ancient times. Until the sea monster dived, they became food and were buried at sea. It is one of the guardians of Atlantis, and like the giant whale Giganto, it obeyed the call from the Horn of Proteus. I never thought there would be such a strong person among the land people. A robed nobleman looked at Superman, who had forced Namor into a disadvantageous position and couldn't help but grunt softly. The existence of Atlantis is even older than the Sumerian civilization, the oldest known human society. So, naturally, they didn't think very highly of the so-called land people. It's all about whether Namor gets the final victory or not. If he fails, then, as a hybrid, what other qualifications does he have to sit on the throne? Another robed nobleman laughed mockingly. I am ashamed at the thought of groveling to a bastard and addressing him as your majesty. The council of elders looked at each other, but they didn't reprimand the treacherous words. Namor is too impulsive, not stable enough, and he isn't fit to be a king. The most respected robed nobleman gave the final word and said, if he loses to a land dweller, it proves that the god of the sea has abandoned him. A king who has lost his favor is not worthy of loyalty. If you can't win, you call a helper. Luke laughed softly as his eyes let out a hot, unparalleled high-temperature beam. The Kraken is almost 150 meters long, like an enlarged version of the giant squid. A dozen powerful tentacles, enough to entangle the carriers parked in the distance and overturn them. Considering the safety of Captain Bullock and the others, Luke used heat vision to cut off a vast tentacle that was coming at him. Rip! The crimson beam slices through. The giant tentacle of the Kraken was cut off at the hip. In pain, the Kraken emitted an ear-splitting wail that shook the eardrum. The remaining tentacles were like mountains, wrapped in terrifying power, smashing the air and sweeping in. Luke unleashes his bioforce field, creating a solid barrier to block the ferocious, powerful thrusts. Boom! Like a baseball hit with full force, he flew backward in an instant. Under the gloomy sky, the dark red cloak left a blurry line of shadow. A silver lightning bolt tore through the sky. Luke stabilized himself with a deep breath and swooped down like a fighter plane. Boom! 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 Heavy explosions resounded in the air. Under the sudden acceleration, the dark red residual shadow broke through the sound barrier and traced a beautiful arc. A fist slammed into the huge, soft head of the Kraken, sending the sea monster underwater. Immediately afterward, strong arms bursting with power wrapped around a tentacle and pulled hard. Grilled, sashimi, or baked, let's just grill it. Luke wondered about how to cook it while looking down and releasing heat vision. The high-temperature beams that could vaporize flesh and blood, like a dazzling red sword, slashed down. Hiss, hiss. The waves lapping at the sea surface instantly evaporated and dried up, emitting a large cloud of white mist. The frantic struggle of a dozen giant tentacles, as if its strength was suddenly taken away, went limp and slippery. Do you have any other tricks? He opened his arms and let the tentacle go. Luke's indifferent eyes swept over the colossal corpse floating on the surface of the sea. Then, he looked at the dumbfounded Namor. He had to say that the strength of the opposition was strong enough to rank among the top powers of the Earth. Especially when there was home advantage and the artifact bonus. But it's a pity that he met Superman. In a U-shaped submarine hidden underwater, the people of the Hellfire Club watched the battlefield through a periscope. Shaw, what should we do next? Namor is not Superman's opponent. The young White Queen asked, clasping her hands to her chest and turning her head sideways. At this point, we have to acknowledge the fact. Luke Cavill, the Army's Major General, is stronger than the mutant Atlantean. I really wonder if he's a human. Sebastian was so angry that he couldn't maintain his usual demeanor and cursed. Namor isn't weak, and he chose the Atlantic Ocean as the battleground. Coupled with the summoned Kraken, he's still no match for Superman. The more he talks, the angrier he gets. He wants to smash his fist through the periscope and completely erase the dark red cloak from his sight. Does it mean that this guy is unbeatable? Sebastian's face was blue, unwilling to accept the reality. If Superman is without weakness, he will be the most powerful humanoid being on Earth. So, what are mutants? The perfect race theory that he believes in has turned into nothing more than empty words. Shaw, are we going to give up on him? Riptide asked suspiciously. Hellfire Club and Atlantis weren't completely tied to the same boat yet. If he wanted to get out this time, he could still do it. No, Namor is a very useful chess piece. Emma was able to implant the psychological suggestion of trusting the mutant in him, so I can't just throw him away. Sebastian waved his hand and said seriously, Riptide, you go and protect Namor. Emma, you tell him to withdraw as soon as possible. If we can't beat Superman, then let's go to war. Let Atlantis and the land world consume each other. The White Queen nodded and placed her finger near her temple as if activating a switch, communicating with Namor in the distance. Run away. The King of Atlantis will never be a coward who runs away. Namor's answer was straightforward and frank. A foolhardy idiotic man. The White Queen was speechless for a while and relayed the message to Sebastian Shaw. Forget it. Take him away by force. Sebastian clenched his teeth. He had seen how Superman killed the 3 battleship class from Berlin in Paris. The young Major General didn't hesitate to kill his enemies. Apart from the Black King Sebastian Shaw, the White Queen, and Riptide, there was a new face in the command cabin. Riptide, you stay here and create a storm. Kenneth, you take me up there and get Namor out of here in the chaos. If only there were no Superman in this world. Sebastian's eyes gleamed with hatred. Yes, Mr. Shaw. Kenneth, the new face, nodded his head. Like the Azazel, he is a mutant with obvious traits. He has a pair of white wings on his back. He can soar in the sky, just like an angel. Kenneth, who is known as Angel, is stronger than Namor. When his body changed, not only did he grow wings, but his bones also became hollow, and his eyes had the dynamic vision of birds of prey. On the surface of the sea, the battle continues. After exhausting all means, Namor still failed to recover from the disadvantage and refused the White Queen's suggestion to escape. His right hand swung the trident, and his body accelerated violently, rushing high into the air. The blazing electric light was like a cannonball. Luke didn't dodge and directly smashed that mass of high-temperature lightning. Ready to fight in close quarters? He asked with a grin. With Sabretooth and Wolverine as human sandbags, Luke had already incorporated Deathstroke's master assassin skills into his consciousness. To be honest, all kinds of combat skills and firearms knowledge could be memorized by only trying a couple of times for him, who had a super brain. But for the experience in battle and slaying from Deathstroke, the rich experience accumulated is a valuable treasure that needs to be digested slowly. Completely mastering and absorbing all of this allowed Luke to earn the equivalent of 6 skill cards. Now, it's time to test the results. A heavy fist that rips through the airwaves, smashing the trident into a halt. Buzz. Buzz. Neptune's trident, made by the hands of the best craftsmen in Atlantis and using the strongest materials, shook so violently that it almost flew out of Namor's hands. I am the holder of 100 consecutive victories in the Atlantis arena. Namor gripped the trident. 2 majestic streams of water spinning at high speed, like a tangled Naga serpent, bombarded the unarmed Luke. The huge impact knocked Superman back a distance. Well, then I'm the winner with the highest rating, the most damage dealt, and the most head count, and probably the most casualties, of any World War II battle. Luke curled his mouth and replied in Namor's own tone. He stomped heavily in the air. The air violently rippled in a circle, visible to the naked eye. Concentrating on capturing the moving trajectory of the dark red shadow, Namor waved his trident and swayed like the wind. The transparent water that swirled at high speed turned into a solid wall. He tried to block Luke's attack. Unfortunately, it had no effect. Luke hit the wall of the water with a hard flying kick. Boom! The terrifying force scattered the high-speed spinning seawater. Namor raised his trident, laced with electricity, and slammed it down with great force. The level in the arena in Atlantis isn't that good. Luke caught it with a quick hand and drove an elbow into Namor's face. The original swollen nose and face suddenly faced another impact. Before Namor could react, Luke snatched the trident, the symbol of Atlantis kingship, with his bare hands. It's my turn. Luke, the villain who beat Namor up and stole his weapon, laughed graciously. Eat this. The Neptune's trident, forged from the cold iron of the deep sea, is one of the King of Atlantis sets. It directly pierced Namor through the heart. For a manic patient like you, reasoning would definitely be useless. In fact, he didn't want to kill the Sea King of his own world. Luke sighed. If they could communicate normally, they could recruit these people into S.H.I.E.L.D. and form a copycat version of the Justice League. Unfortunately, Namor wasn't really a good person to team up with. He was more like an annoying person who never grew up and loved to go around, robbing people of their weapons and finances and speak big words in public, opening his mouth to trap himself. So, there's someone else. Seeing that the sea suddenly rolled up with a storm, Luke pulled out the trident running through Namor's chest and carried the other person by the neck in his other hand. Atlantean's strong life force allowed him to continue to breathe and retain a glimmer of life. Sebastian Shaw, I've got you. Luke swept his supervision across the sea and caught a glimpse of a white figure rising to the sky. A flying mutant? A middle-aged man was also held below him. Luke, who had seen a photo, immediately recognized that it was Sebastian Shaw. Watch out for his attacks. Sebastian warned. Kenneth, flying at high speed with open wings, was like a speeding glider, approaching Superman in midair. You want to take Namor away? Luke chuckled. Red beams of light burst out from his eyes. Boom! The high-temperature energy that evaporated everything hit the bird in midair. In the nick of time, Kenneth followed instructions and raised Mr. Shaw, who held onto him with both hands as a shield, to deflect the terrifying heat vision. Back at you, Sebastian, unharmed, raised his hand to release the absorbed energy. Luke, who swooped down at an amazing speed, was directly hit by heat vision, which bounced back. His right hand released the dying Namor and left him behind. Quickly, after catching Namor and achieving his goal, Sebastian decisively ran away. Namor, forget it, you can get the weapon back later. Sebastian dragged Namor, who was dying and kept mumbling, trident, back to the submarine. Get the Atlanteans on the line. We can't stop Superman. He shook Namor, who had a sad look in his eyes, and told the boy to wake up and stop thinking about Neptune's trident. The depth limit of the submarine is 320 meters, so it might not be able to escape Superman's eyesight. When the time came, if he caught up, members of the Hellfire Club, who had no natural ability to breathe underwater, may face the end of the group. Mr. Shaw, you're right. Realizing the threat of death, Namor temporarily puts aside his beloved trident. The weapon means as much to him as the Mjolnir hammer does to Thor, and it carries with it an inseparable feeling. I'll get it back to Atlantis first. Covering his bleeding chest, the young king obeyed his inner will and emitted a special sound that called out to the creatures of the deep. You seem to have been left behind, my friend. Luke, caught off guard by the heat vision, looked at the tornadoes rotating at high speed on the sea and stirred up a smile on his lips. Sebastian Shaw had escaped with Namor. Riptide, who had somehow been left behind, froze for a moment and found the submarine had disappeared. This is wrong. Isn't my task to interfere with Superman's vision and create chaos? Where is everyone? All of them ran away. How could such an obvious submarine disappear so quickly? A series of question marks emerged from Riptide's head. His high-speed rotating body suddenly stopped. The young mutant, who just reacted, directly manipulated the airflow to form a whirlwind that carried him away quickly. It would be a fool's errand to stay and fight Superman. You want to leave now? Too late. Luke held the trident in his hand and narrowed his eyes to confirm the target. Just like throwing a javelin, it shot out in a straight line. Whoosh! The atmosphere exploded. A golden shadow, like a flash of lightning, directly hit Riptide, who was running away. I'll consider this as finding experimental material for Dr. Trask. Luke dived down and caught Riptide, who was skewered by the trident. "Don't let me down, Sebastian Shaw. With your ability to make things happen, you should have no problem creating a war." The young Major General stood at the surface of the sea and looked down. The U-shaped submarine drifted underwater, but the command module was empty. Atlantis, Poseidonia. Namor, who was seriously injured, climbed out of the large nutrition pool. He had been in a coma for 4 hours, and his naked body was covered in the sticky nano-dissolving solution. The ferocious wound on his chest healed initially, with only a slight feeling of dull pain. The thought of his beloved trident falling into the hands of a landlubber, being played with, touched, and used, made Namor angry. "Your Majesty, your injury hasn't fully healed, don't get agitated," the medical officer advised. "Neptune's trident is an artifact from Atlantis and a symbol of kingship. The surface is engraved with magical runes that influence the weather and will cause electric shock damage when it strikes a person." Even Namor, who is far superior in physical quality and extremely strong in vitality, was almost killed instantly. "Where are my invited guests?" Namor ignored the medical officer, frowned, and asked. "They are staying in the water prisons," the medical officer replied hesitantly. Elder Raman said that they were land people and had to be watched as they entered Atlantis as intruders. Namor grimaced and said nothing. With anger rising, there was also an obvious pain in his chest. "Take me to the water prisons," he squeezed the words out between his gritting teeth. 20 minutes later, the Hellfire Club, wearing breathing equipment, appeared in the assembly hall. Namor leaned back on his throne and looked down on the robed nobles from above. "You imprisoned my compatriots, my guests, and claimed that it was for the safety of Atlantis." His tone was cold, tinged with a trace of anger. "Yes, Your Majesty. Over the years, no land people had ever set foot in our country, let alone entered the capital Poseidonia and stood in the assembly hall." A robed nobleman raised his head and spoke without fear. "This is a violation of tradition and an overreach. The elders couldn't just stand by and watch you make a mistake, so they stopped it. It was our duty as well." Namor pursed his lips. His eyes became even colder. He lost Neptune's trident, which shook his unstable throne. Namor, whose emotions fluctuate violently, suppressed his inner anger and slowly said, "I am the king of Atlantis. And yet my subjects don't give half the respect I deserve. Is that not a kind of overreach? Your Majesty, in the history of Atlantis, there has never been a mixed-race king, and there has never been a king who lost his trident and escaped a battle." Another noble stood up. When the layer of respect between ruler and subject was removed, all that remained was naked contempt and rejection. "Very good." The angry Namor stood up and loudly said, "Because I don't have blue skin like yours, I am regarded as a bastard and an outsider. Even the teachers in charge of royal education were unwilling to talk to me, and the high priest even advised my grandfather to expel me. My mother, a royal princess, lived a luxurious life since childhood. To protect me, she had to hide in the slum, suffering from the environment and cruel life. I have been ridiculed and bullied more than any of you since I was a child. They have taught me to keep my distance from other people to avoid getting hurt, and they have shown me that humanity is terrible, which has nothing to do with color and race. You're not noble. Atlanteans are no different from land dwellers. They're as narrow and selfish. Ah no, land dwellers at least know how to study. When they were still drilling for fire, Atlantis was already studying the use of ocean resources, but now they are learning to control nuclear energy, and you are still stuck in the tradition of 10,000 years ago, clinging to it. What ancestral rules? You're just scared by the gods and immortals, so we hide at the bottom of the sea and dare not go out." Namor walked down the steps as he spoke. "Your Majesty, do you know what you are talking about?" A robe aristocrat asked angrily. "Of course, I know." Namor covered his chest and coughed twice. His other hand quickly reached out and lifted the other person. "You may not know, but the color I hate most is blue." Crack. His 5 fingers closed together, and his arms swelled with power. The robed aristocrat's neck tilted to one side and his eyes wide open. At his dying breath, he still couldn't believe that Namor would take action against him. "Look how stupid it is. Kings can't execute nobles. Take these rules with you to the god of the sea." Namor laughed sarcastically and began an unprecedented slaughter. Those guards outside heard the sound and broke into the council chamber, but they could only stare in disbelief. Because according to the rules, any actions against the king were equivalent to rebellion. Sebastian, as a bystander, had a satisfied smile on his face while wearing the breathing device. He glanced quietly at the White Queen and spoke in a voice only she could hear, "Well done." The latter was calm as if she hadn't done anything. Hatred blinded Namor's eyes. If he could calm down and think carefully. With the strength of the Hellfire Club, could Atlantis soldiers put them in jail? Moreover, if the robed noblemen of the Council of Elders wanted to turn against them, they should have created a public outcry to draw public opinion. Instead of provoking the king without any preparation. A few minutes later, when the massacre was over, the bodies of aristocrats and nobles were lying in the hall. Sebastian asked in a deep voice, "Your Majesty, what should we do next?" Wiping the blood from his hands, Namor felt like he had laid down a big stone weighing on his heart, and his whole body became much lighter. He went up the steps and took the throne, saying a word for word, "War. Give the land world a war." Washington, D.C., SHIELD Headquarters Building. This is the trident that can manipulate the weather and set off a tsunami? Like a curious baby, Howard stared at the golden trident on the table, his eyes full of interest. Its energy readings fluctuate greatly and are very unstable. It seems like a bomb that could detonate at any time. About the change in readings, the trident's energy source, it should be relying on the strange words inscribed on the surface. Like solar panels, they absorb energy. Then, guided by complex circuits to the top. Howard took a self-made energy reading machine and scanned the trident isolated in a solid glass layer. If Luke hadn't specifically told him not to touch a will before he left, he would have set out to study it. The weapons tycoon is always enthusiastic about new things. The temporary silence of the Tesseract has left Howard without a target in the short term. Namor's golden trident is a great new option. Luke said it was attached with magic power. It's very dangerous. Carter reminded him. Magic, haha, that's just another manifestation of science. As a gifted scientist, Howard is undoubtedly a staunch materialist. He doesn't believe that there were magicians, witches, vampires, and werewolves in this world. Those were fantastical creatures imagined by third-rate writers, satisfying people's longing for the unknown. I once thought so until Luke told me that under the surface of the world, there was a magical society in which sorcerers and demons coexisted, and werewolves and vampire clans coexisted. Carter shrugged her shoulders. As the commander of S.H.I.E.L.D., she was naturally entitled to know the existence of the Temple of the Three and the Karma Taj. Besides, she saw Luke conjure up a fireball out of thin air. This led Carter to wonder if the rumor that Superman and many female warlocks have a super-friendly relationship was true. Luke, who originally wanted to explain what magic is, ended up smearing his image. He had to affirm that he wasn't a demon hunter repeatedly, no scars on his face, wouldn't be stabbed to death by a pitchfork, and wouldn't jump from a height of 3 meters and then fall to his death. If you have the opportunity, you can let him take you to see it and satisfy your curiosity. Hearing Carter says this, Howard felt dubious. Although he often makes fun of Luke by calling him a warlock piledriver, he never thought that any kind of horned, flaming Aryan demon, scantily clad, glamorous, and charming female warlock existed. But if he had to choose, he would like the former to be false and the latter to be true. I'd like to see what a female warlock who plays with other people's emotions and indulges in carnal pleasures looks like. Howard said with a slight hum and a straight face. It's almost like writing, "Come, seduce me. I'm easily seduced by women," on his forehead. Carter rolled her eyes. She didn't want to get involved in this topic. She swept a glance at the trident surrounded by electricity and said in an agitated tone, "I have to organize the information on Atlantis. You'd better not touch it. I don't want to wait for Luke to come back and find that SHIELD's chief research consultant has turned into a lump of charcoal." Carter knew perfectly well that every time Howard discovered something new, he couldn't help but want to study it. Moreover, he had that, too bold he could die, aggressiveness. Before S.H.I.E.L.D. had been reorganized, it was called the Strategic Science Reserve. This gifted and intelligent weapons tycoon was almost killed because he was testing the energy equilibrium of the Tesseract. I am not a brat who's ready to make a mess when my parents aren't home. Howard curled his lips and acted as if he didn't care. The Tesseract is my best toy, and this pitchfork is only the second best. Is that right? Why'd I hear that your research on the Tesseract is going nowhere, and you're moving on to other projects? In the face of Carter's relentless breakdown, Howard's face was a bit embarrassed. Since the Tesseract was motionless and unresponsive, it only looked like a cold block of steel. Howard, who lost interest at the moment, had gone through building a nuclear reactor. To do so, he and Luke teamed up and pulled another wave of funding from the budget committee. The counselors who usually held onto their moneybags and refused to let go of them easily were now scared when they heard S.H.I.E.L.D's name. There's no way out, they didn't have a single drop left. By the way, where's Luke? Where did he go? Howard digressed and solemnly said, to be honest, I've recently become interested in marine biology. Carter gave the other party a blank look. You, interested in marine biology? It was obvious that he was bored and wanted to do something interesting. Luke told her a long time ago that Howard was an adventurous and unusual guy at heart. Only scientific research could make him tolerate loneliness a little, but nothing else, not even women. After all, it is a Stark family tradition for men to change their bed partners more often than their clothes before getting married. At this time, Luke should be in the White House. Carter tossed her hair and whispered, "This isn't over yet. The emergence of a marine civilization is enough to spark a heated debate around the world. Testing, inquiring, collecting information, faced with an unknown civilization, each country pulls out all the stops." Moreover, Luke defeated Namor Mackenzie and proved the power of the land world through a battle, but this doesn't mean that Atlantis would choose peaceful coexistence. In any case, we're all ready for war. From now on, S.H.I.E.L.D. will be busy. Howard scratched his head, thinking about the war between marine civilization and the land world. Then Stark Industries will receive another wave of orders, won't it? White House, Oval Office. The couch was filled with people. The president, the chief of staff, the generals from the Pentagon, the head of the FBI. If a missile fell from the sky and destroyed everyone here, the country would be instantly paralyzed. This mess was caused by S.H.I.E.L.D. They searched everywhere for mutant freaks and also made a Weapon X program to pull in those dangerous elements to perform various tasks, which led to the later events. Edgar Hoover of the FBI took the lead in speaking out. The president called them here to discuss how to deal with Atlantis. The king of that marine civilization, Namor Mackenzie, a mutant, is doing this to get justice for his compatriots. This is a legitimate reason and nothing to be condemned. So, I think we can compromise appropriately, for example, by ending the S.H.I.E.L.D. recruitment and housing program for mutants, which will give the United States a chance to breathe. I'm sure no one here wants another war. Hoover's analysis was clear-headed. He looked at the frowning president and continued, "We won't get any benefits in this war. First of all, there will be resistance among the people. World War II had just ended. Who would want to carry a gun and fight a bunch of marine people? Secondly, we still don't know Atlantis' military strength. However, judging from the strength demonstrated by Namor Mackenzie, it shouldn't be any worse. They can live underwater, make tsunamis and hurricanes. If the battlefield is on the sea surface, the carrier fleet would naturally be in a weaker position and could only be beaten passively." The admirals of the Navy Department nodded their heads. The two carriers of the Atlantic Fleet were defenseless against the surprise attack from Atlantis. The blue-skinned undersea people were like smaller, stealthier micro-submarines, unpredictable and hard to look out for. The vast expanse of the sea is their territory. However, Major General Cavill defeated Namor Mackenzie, the Atlantean who had threatened the lives of more than 7 million people in New York with a tsunami, and was defeated. A senior officer of the Army Department said, "Since ancient times, there has never been a compromise by the victor. I am opposed to any idea put forward by people wanting to surrender." Hoover looked sullen and said coldly, "General, no one said to surrender. Before a war begins, you want to settle the conflict by compromise. This is surrendering. If we take a step back, there will be a second step. Do we have to raise the white flag directly in the face of threats and aggression like the French?" A senior military officer belonging to the Army Department spoke without mercy. This serious accusation made the office a little more heated. Seeing the FBI boss being blasted, the Navy Department stepped up to the plate and began choosing sides. Anyway, Director Hoover is right. S.H.I.E.L.D. causes trouble with Atlantis. The Atlantic Fleet lost 2 aircraft carriers, Anna Maria Island was hit by a tsunami, and we suffered heavy losses, and someone needs to take responsibility for that. Haha, you must have forgotten who pushed the USS Lincoln and the USS Stennis back to the dock. A bigwig from the Army Department said sarcastically, "Without Major General Cavill, the Atlantic Fleet would have lost more than just the 2 carriers, and we might even have lost our sea position and been forced to retreat home. At that time, your Navy will have to face disbandment in the end." What a joke. If the Navy is disbanded, what future does the country have? What can your army do to expand the country and fight for its interests and influence? A big man in a white uniform retorted. Motherfucker. When I was in World War I, your navy was still following behind the Brits' ass. The number of opposing people continued to grow, with a clear line between white and green uniforms, pushing Hoover directly to one side. The quarrel in the office was getting louder and louder. Seeing that the Navy Department and the War Department were rolling up their sleeves, ready to fight with their fists, the president coughed twice while covering his face and banged on the table. You are all soldiers of the United States. How could you have no regard for decency and act like street thugs? The issue of accountability for the Atlantis incident has passed. The president acted as a mediator to stop the confrontation from continuing. Major General Cavill prevented Namor's plan of flooding New York, which wasn't only without fault, but also with credit. According to him, Atlantis could set off a tsunami with the trident held by the king. The weapon has been seized and kept in S.H.I.E.L.D., which is not a threat for the time being. What we are talking about now is how to deal with the existence of Atlantis. The Pentagon knows nothing about it, and the only information it has is from S.H.I.E.L.D. Whether it's war or peace, there should be a plan. Hoover, who was scolded before, sprang up, and said with a twinkle in his eye, Mr. President, with all due respect, to improve the efficiency of intelligence work, S.H.I.E.L.D. should share information with the FBI and the CIA. Only through sincere cooperation can information errors be reduced. Haha, Director Hoover, to improve the fertility rate of Americans, why don't you share your mistress with everyone, and cooperate sincerely? The vulgar words of the Army Department caused a great burst of laughter. Even the Navy Department didn't hold back. In the Oval Office, there was a lively atmosphere. Thus, when quarreling, speaking cheekily was generally effective. Hoover turned red with anger and resisted the urge to swear, saying, "This is the White House. General, you should pay attention to your words. When did the head of the FBI suffer such injustice? Yes, gentlemen, keep your manners." The president, who was holding back his laughter, stepped forward to intervene. Director Hoover is also committed to public service and wants to increase access to intelligence, so there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that S.H.I.E.L.D. is responsible for unusual events, mutants, Atlantis, and so on, and must ensure confidentiality. S.H.I.E.L.D., as well as the director, have proven their value. Faced with the threat of Atlantis, the United States relies more on Superman. As for the FBI, they should just go to a safer place and just stay there. Mr. President, Major General Cavill has arrived. The ivory phone on the table rang when the group couldn't come up with anything yet. The president sat up straight and wiped his glasses. Those generals who had been quarreling with each other just now had also tidied up their messy military uniforms and showed a steady appearance. Half a minute later, the tall figure pushed open the door and walked into the Oval Office. "Gentlemen, there's a war coming," he said. "Major General, you have worked hard." When Luke pushed the door in and stepped on the blue carpet in the Oval Office, the president's face was filled with a kind smile. The intimate greeting, as if Luke is his own son, reveals a doting father-like tone. A few hours earlier, the young man with the title of S.H.I.E.L.D. Director, and Major General of the Army, pushed 2 damaged carriers back to the large dock at Norfolk Naval Base with his bare hands. The scene was spectacular. The sailors who witnessed it called it a miracle. Before that, no one had ever thought that a flesh and blood body could move an aircraft carrier weighing tens of thousands of tons. It's like an ant trying to push a big tree, an impossible fantasy. Captain Bullock, who has always been famous for his composure, was stunned. If the Allies have such super soldiers, how did those bastards in the Axis survive? The massive starrier and the small figure formed a huge contrast, thus creating a sense of power, causing everyone to hold their breath and were too afraid to make a sound. It was not until the USS Lincoln was in motion that the enthusiastic cheers and applause broke out. Afterward, Nimitz, the Navy commander, heard the news and joked that there was no need for the country to invest huge sums of money each year in nuclear energy research and engage in a covert competition with the Soviets. Compared with the atomic bomb, Superman, who can strike accurately and cause extensive damage, is more suitable as a strategic weapon with deterrent power. The president agreed with this. Unfortunately for him, the launch button for Superman, unlike the atomic bomb, wasn't in his own hands. "I only made a modest contribution." Luke said a few words and walked over to his desk. After beating Namor hard and pushing the aircraft carrier by hand, his reputation rose slightly. It's easier to make a big splash than to keep a low profile. Colonel Phillips hired a private photographer for him, for the scene of pushing the aircraft carrier. Later, it was the USS Stennis' turn, so they took a lot of pictures. By tomorrow morning, Luke will be dominating all the headlines in the New York papers. The threat from Atlantis doesn't end there. Namor Mackenzie holds a certain amount of hatred towards humans. Instead of squeezing into the large sofa occupied by the Pentagon generals, the Major General pulled out a high-backed chair and sat down. For Superman, the amount of exercise to push the aircraft carrier with bare hands was almost equal to the average person's 20 bench presses. He still felt a little tired. Major General Cavill, are you warning us to be prepared for war? The president looked solemn, pushed the glasses on the bridge of his nose, and whispered, what should the Pentagon do next? The red bear on the Siberian plains was already causing enough headaches. The emergence of an ancient Atlantean civilization is a disaster. Although it is said that the 21st century bald-headed eagle liked to stir up trouble and intervene in other countries' politics through the threat of force. However, that is based on their own military strength and overseas branch operations everywhere. The world landscape is now gradually shifting to two poles. The prologue of the Cold War has begun to take shape. There was still a long way to go before the age of dominance of a single country and a superpower. I am just an ordinary general who hasn't mentioned anything. For such professional questions, the president should ask the generals here. Luke made a modest expression and waved his hand. They are all experienced and outstanding generals who have experienced World War I and World War II and have a profound understanding of the situation of the war and the various tactics of the air, land, and sea. How is it my turn to express my views? The president, who was holding his forehead in his hand, took a deep breath. He didn't know what to say. He had to turn his attention to the generals from the Pentagon, who were all silent, with no sign of their high intensity from the quarrel earlier. They don't even know the exact location of Atlantis, let alone how to fight it. No matter how much money was invested in the aircraft carrier budget, it would be vain to encounter Atlantis, a marine civilization. Major General Cavill, S.H.I.E.L.D. has a certain degree of understanding of the people at the bottom of the sea. The president, who was being tossed around like a ball, had no choice but to look again at the young general sitting across from him. You will be the commander of the upcoming war. This responsibility is yours. With a smug expression on his face, Luke said, how can I, an unmeritorious general, take up such an important task? Wouldn't that mean that the generals are incompetent? What's more, the efficiency of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s work is far less than that of the FBI under Director Hoover, whose leadership skills and strategic vision are far superior to mine. Edgar Hoover, who played the role of a small transparent person since Luke arrived, immediately became the focus of the entire room. The FBI bigwig said, no, Major General Cavill must be joking. Sir, part of the reason for this incident with Atlantis is S.H.I.E.L.D. but ultimately, my ability is still limited. With a sincere face, Luke continued, I have done some deep self-reflection and have decided to step aside as S.H.I.E.L.D.'s director. The next intelligence work can be handed over to Director Hoover, who has always had a reputation as the top agent, making many successful apprehensions of Soviet spies. I believe that he will soon be able to find Atlantis. Hoover, who was sitting in the corner, was restless. He was now regretting it, very remorseful. Why did he mess with S.H.I.E.L.D.? Feeling the various eyes focused on him, Hoover decisively and bitterly said from the heart, those are all false rumors. The FBI's ability to do its job has been lacking, far less than that of S.H.I.E.L.D. under Major General Cavill. The president nodded in agreement. At this time, of course, they need to be close to the person who could solve the problem. Although Major General Cavill always asks for funds and doesn't do things properly, making people feel a little stifled. But when it comes to critical moments, he can demonstrate good use. Major General, since Secretary Hoover has said so, you are still in charge of the war plan for Atlantis. The command of the Pentagon will also be transferred to you. The president gave the final word, fearing that the other party would refuse. That's fine. Alas, I am a mediocre Army Major General. Luke smiled, seemingly helpless, and reluctantly accepted this appointed task. No way, the greater the ability, the greater the responsibility. In that case, I would like to say a few words to do my job better, to carry out actions, and to confirm my credibility. I think we should separate S.H.I.E.L.D. from the Pentagon. The Major General, who held power, spoke eloquently as if he had a plan. Atlantis isn't a small country. It has a long history, profound background, and military strength to be reckoned with. As you can see, Namor alone is enough to flatten the Second Fleet in the Atlantic Ocean. Ordinary weapons, and ordinary soldiers, can hardly threaten Atlantis. Therefore, S.H.I.E.L.D. must recruit more people. Only a strong enough team can cope with an even more terrible crisis. The young Major General, who said that his ability was limited and difficult for him to take on the big job, gave 23 detailed and specific guidelines, dumbfounding the President and the generals. It feels like it was written in advance and memorized. The above is my little, insignificant personal opinion. 40 minutes later, Luke, who didn't even feel thirsty, finished his speech. Major General Cavill, do you have anything to add? After listening to the long speech, the President's brain was a bit inflated, and he asked subconsciously. He didn't expect Luke to prepare so well, just like an examiner who prepared the answer in advance and filled out the questionnaire. In particular, the plans for the future development of S.H.I.E.L.D. are detailed and specific. Up to the enrollment expansion of personnel in various departments, down to the application requirements of fixed funds every year. This made the Chief of Staff sitting on the other side of the sofa's eyelids twitch, and his heart fluttered with concern. The poor Budget Committee, if he kept on pulling the wool over their eyes like this, their heads would go bald. Then I'll say a few more words, Luke, who was going to stop, said with surprise. It seems that the President wasn't bored with his ideas. So he cleared his throat and started a repetition mode. Some common sentences have been changed from his previous proposal. The amount of budget and funds, the number of staff in various departments, and so on has increased. Then, he said it again. When the long rambling was over, the President sitting across the table and the generals on the couch were expressionless and dull-eyed. For the second time, Luke used Constantine's expert in deception skill card. To everyone in the Oval Office, every word that popped out of Luke's mouth converged into a blast of sound similar to a mental attack. It's worthless nonsense, but it's burned into their mind, and they couldn't help but want to listen to it. This is my personal, immature opinion. Luke concluded with this sentence. In the Oval Office, it suddenly went quiet. No one said anything, even the sound of breathing was very faint. The President sitting across from him and the generals on the sofa was as lifeless as wooden statues. This is a perfect plan. After a while, the President nodded in agreement with a bitter look on his face. He didn't want to be mentally bombarded again, and the rest of the group echoed the sentiment, fearing that Major General Cavill would go on and on. S.H.I.E.L.D. will surely live up to the trust of the President and the generals. Luke looked touched and appreciated his language skills. Those requirements sound harsh, such as the director's free working hours, generous salary subsidies, and the right to obtain any information from the intelligence agencies under the Pentagon at will. Have been successfully passed. The world's greatest con man is amazing. Luke sighed. Unfortunately, Constantine in the studio next door was too metaphysical, otherwise, he would brush up on this ability. After all, eloquence is a necessary skill for every protagonist. In this case, he could nominate a certain blonde guy to become something similar to Naruto, with the setting of love and justice, swaying people with eloquent talk about peace, so that countless strong people would be defeated at his feet. If there is nothing else, today's meeting is over. The President looked exhausted. Listening to Luke's speech had consumed most of his energy. This was like facing 4 or 5 beautiful girls with hot bodies all at once. After having a good time, you suddenly feel overwhelmed. You wouldn't be interested in sex even when you see another beautiful body. The Pentagon generals also got up one after another, one by one, as if they had stayed up all night, their eyes red and their feet staggering as they pushed the door and left. They had all been drained of every ounce of energy by Major General Cavill, and their minds were still reverberating with his long-winded ramblings. Then, it's time to meet an old friend. Luke, who achieved his goal, flew up and headed for the next stop. Old Joseph's Tavern, Brooklyn. Rogers, who returned to ordinary life, sat in a corner seat with a glass of lager on the table. He is waiting for a friend. They made an appointment for lunch. And Luke stood himself up. Ding ding. A crisp copper bell rang. Someone pushed in the door of the tavern that was closed for a short break. Hey, old Joseph, long time no see. You're still as sturdy as ever. Luke, who entered the pub, greeted the old man standing behind the bar. They were all old familiar customers. In the past, when he was still a spirited young boy in Brooklyn, he used to help old Joseph to look after the store. Also cleaning tables and washing up, to earn some pocket money. The other party was once a truck driver. Unfortunately, he was unlucky. Every time he delivered goods, he always encountered inexplicable accidents such as overturning, flat tires, and engine problems. Not only that, but even bicycles have accidents, either hitting people or being hit by people. In old Joseph's own words, He had a lifelong feud with the cargo, and once he came into contact with them, he would get bad luck. In desperation, he could only change careers and open a tavern, barely making a living. However, since Luke became a war hero, this tavern's business flourished, and many New Yorkers came here to check it out. Luke, you little bastard. Hey, now a general. Frank probably never thought that his nephew could become a war hero in his life. Old Joseph said with a smile, poured a glass of beer, and handed it over. I wonder if Mr. Major General would accept a malt beer from Brooklyn when he's used to high-end red wine. Luke shrugged his shoulders and lifted his mug of beer. Glug glug. Glug glug. I'll have another one. Luke, who finished his drink in a single go, chuckled. Old Joseph nodded with satisfaction and filled his glass. How does it feel to be back in Brooklyn? Seeing Luke come and sit down with his beer, Rogers asked with a smile. Since the end of the war, he has entered a semi-retired state. Not bad. On the way to the tavern, I met several familiar faces. Luke leaned back in his chair, lifted his head, and said, there was Jamie, who we used to fight. He's now a truck driver, following in his father's footsteps. And Uncle Frank, who used to sell fruit on the opposite street, gave Bucky a bread bag for free. At that time, everyone had a hard time. Yeah. You know what? That Jamie guy is always bragging to people that he was beaten up by Superman once and boasting about it. Rogers took a sip of his beer. His face showed a bit of nostalgia. Luke, I've been dreaming these days. In the dream, you, and Bucky were running through the streets of Brooklyn. There was no Captain America, Superman, or Sergeant Barnes. Then we jumped back into the battlefield. I saw Bucky fall off a cliff. To stop Red Skull, I boarded the plane carrying Valkyrie missiles. I don't know why you weren't in this story. I fell into a cold place, and no one woke me up until a long time later. They said that the war was over. I lived alone, with no friends, no family, and no destination to run to. Luke stared at the bubbling wine glass and laughed. You sound like an old man in his 70s. Haha, that's what Marjorie said. Perhaps I experienced too much in the war to forget all those memories. Rogers restrained his sentimental mood. He is now on the military payroll, and all he needs to do is punch in regularly and sit in the office all day with a newspaper to read. Occasionally, he would cooperate with publicity work and be interviewed by the media. When peace came, heroes seemed to be useless. Do you have an answer to the last question? Luke looked at Captain America and whispered, Captain America can't sit in an office and read newspapers all his life. Pick up that shield, go back to the battlefield, and shuttle through the rain of bullets. Such a tense life would make your heart beat violently and leave you with a genuine feeling of being alive. I quite agree with Howard's point of view. One of the greatest pleasures in life lies in the adventure. The pursuit of excitement. Willing to be ordinary is the life that you should have after experiencing everything and despising everything. Rogers kept silent. He lives in an old house in Brooklyn. The walls were repainted, the furniture such as sofas and big beds were replaced with new ones, and the bedroom was covered with soft carpets. He did all these trivial things himself. Marjorie, who came to live with him, said she was bored and wanted to pass the time. Rogers agreed to this. He had space in his heart that he couldn't fill. That's why he had to find something to do. You want me to join S.H.I.E.L.D. because of Atlantis? Rogers asked. The attack on 2 aircraft carriers and the tsunami that hit Anna Maria Island have all made headlines. In addition, being in the Army Department, Captain America had heard some rumors. Not all of them. Major General Cavill needed a partner, so he thought of his old buddy, Captain America. Luke looked at the hesitant Rogers and smiled. Are you ready to go to war, Steve? In a trance, Captain America remembered the rescue operation he and Luke did to recover Bucky, and the other party asked him the same thing. Ready, sir. Thinking about the good times of fighting side by side, Rogers smiled and raised his glass. Then, welcome to the invaders, Luke said. The 2 glasses clinked, making a crisp sound. A few days later, the name of Atlantis appeared on the newspaper's front page, causing a sudden sensation. An ancient marine civilization, which has never been heard of, had officially entered the public's eye. Governments have long known about the amazing battles in the Atlantic Ocean and the existence of Atlantis. Thus, no matter what news, the public would always be the last group to know. The response to marine civilization varies from country to country. As usual, the Red Bear of Siberia is vigorously developing the nuclear industry on the one hand and is secretly wary of Superman on the other. As for the threat of Atlantis, That's a question that Americans should consider. Anyway, they won't be able to attack Siberia for a while. England, increasingly weakened, is actively communicating with the White House to get some information about the situation. Although they have MI6, people worldwide could pick up hot chicks full of James Bond style. But in the face of Atlantis living at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, they didn't know where to start. The Prime Minister once wanted to turn to the hidden forces of the dark world, such as the witch groups active in London, werewolves, vampires, and the like. Unfortunately, there was little success, and no useful information was obtained. This group of dark creatures was born no more than 1,000 years ago. Nothing is known about that period of history tens of thousands of years ago, except for vampires. Those nocturnal creatures who were afraid of sunshine had a wonderful connection with Atlantis. Their ancestors came from an oceanic country deep in the Atlantic Ocean. At that time, Atlantis hadn't sunk yet and was in its heyday and glory. Varney, the great wizard, got the Book of Darkness left by Chthon, the elder god, and gained great power from it, turning himself into a vampire. This was the birth of the first vampire on Earth. Later, the continental plates collided, and Atlantis sank in its prime. Varney, the great wizard, felt that he had lived long enough to see through life and intended to stop wandering, so he passed the power to Dracula. Since then, the vampire clan has thrived in the land world, gradually becoming a hidden force in the dark world. England's side is at a loss, while the ancient countries of the East across the Pacific aren't concerned. Even the SPEAR organization that could tear apart the Japanese Superman thought blue-skinned Atlanteans in the area were nothing. If they dared to go ashore, we could eat you up like crawfish. The Atlantic Ocean, Poseidonia, this capital of Atlantis, was no longer as calm as before. Troops from all sides are gathering, and the pre-war tension is spreading. The land world is in turmoil, and the marine civilization isn't much better. Namor, who slaughtered the robed nobles in one fell swoop, succeeded in taking power, even though many people denounced his tyranny and chose to stand up against it. But there was no storm, and it was soon suppressed. This is one of the benefits of class hierarchies. Namor leaned back on his throne, his right hand hanging down somewhat uncomfortably, as he usually was holding his beloved trident. When there is a lack of competent leaders, it is difficult for the weak to threaten the rule of the strong. The rebels formed multiple forces and stormed the royal palace in the center of Poseidonia. However, the soldiers were scattered and couldn't build a proper army. Namor didn't even have to do it himself. The guards took care of those people. I think there's a reason why the majority of the people of Atlantis are in favor of the war. Sebastian wore a breathing apparatus. Through the transparent shield, he spoke in a jarring tone. For many years, there has been a clear line between the lower class and the nobility in this country, with lineage and birth determining the future of each individual. Your Majesty, you have grown up in the slums of Poseidonia and have seen the Atlanteans at the bottom. They repeat similar lives every day. When they see the aristocrats and nobles, they have to take the initiative to salute. They pay high taxes every day, every month, and every year, and bear the pressure of a hard life. The way upward is blocked, and the conflict between the nobles and the commoners grows fierce, but the submissiveness rooted in the bones of the Atlanteans keeps them docile. Sebastian Shaw spoke eloquently as if he were a trusted advisor to the king. Sitting on the throne, Namor nodded and felt deeply impressed. When he was very young, he fled to the slum with his mother and experienced the warmth of human kindness. He had a certain understanding of the lower class in Atlantis. A foreign war is the best way to shift the conflict. It can provide military merit so that civilians could see the hope of further promotion across the hierarchy. It can also help consolidate Your Majesty's authority by winning one victory after another. Sebastian looked loyal and sincere on the surface, with a dim light in his eyes. As long as we can get rid of Superman, the Atlantis army will be invincible and can conquer the whole land world. When it came to Superman, Namor's chest ached a little. Then, he thought of Neptune's trident that had been taken away. For a moment, the pleasant mood turned bad. Mr. Shaw, you have a strong talent for absorbing energy. If you join hands with me, will we have a chance to defeat Superman? Thinking for a while, Namor asked in a low voice. As Superman's defeated opponent, he knew very well that his opponent was among the top in strength, speed, and combat sense. He was no match when fighting alone. But when dealing with a land dweller, did he need to follow any rules? It would be wise to attack him together. In the Hellfire Club, the only one who could restrain Superman was Sebastian Shaw. Namor thought that if they worked together, they might have a winning chance. Ahem. Your Majesty, I'm just a scientist. I'm not good at fighting. Feeling the look of anticipation from above, Sebastian looked calm and steady like an old dog on the surface, but he panicked. Having seen Luke crush Berlin's battleship class unilaterally and then beat Namor to the ground to the point of nearly dying, how could he still have the will to fight? The previous threat to teach Superman a lesson was just inflated inner rhetoric. Sebastian preferred to work hard to improve and wait until his abilities were further advanced before taking action to destroy the enemy himself in a sober state. The nuclear industry is being actively developed, and soon they will be able to build the first generation of nuclear reactors. In time, I will absorb the energy and make myself stronger. Sebastian, brimming with confidence, exclaimed, I believe that even Superman can't withstand the terrifying power of an atomic explosion. The nuclear industry is being actively developed, and soon they will be able to build the first generation of nuclear reactors. In time, I will absorb the energy and make myself stronger. Sebastian, brimming with confidence, exclaimed, I believe that even Superman couldn't withstand the terrifying power of an atomic explosion. Namor frowned, still not relaxed. He asked reluctantly, is there nothing we can do about Superman? The golden trident, the symbol of Atlantis' kingship, is still in his hands, and if we can't get it back, sooner or later, more rebels will come forward. There are other means to do this. Sebastian pondered for a moment, hesitantly said, legend has it that the first mutant in history was named Apocalypse. His physical strength was so strong that he was once regarded as a deity. As the long years were too boring, Apocalypse fell into a deep sleep. If I can find his whereabouts and get the way to reach the end of the evolutionary path from the hand of this great god and break the restrictions of the mutant species, I may be able to defeat Superman. Sebastian said vaguely, he didn't want to wake up the legendary mutant god. No one wanted to have a boss sitting on top of them. He just relayed the information on Apocalypse, only to temporarily calm Namor's agitated emotions. Apocalypse. Namor's eyes lit up slightly as if he had a plan. SHIELD Headquarters Building, Washington, D.C. Howard was busy in Lab Number 1. A chicken's nest-like messy hair and heavy dark circles under his eyes indicate that he hasn't been getting enough sleep. So, is this what you got? Luke said with his arms over his chest, looking at the model in front of him and frowning, a smaller version of a nuclear reactor? That's right. Although the Tesseract doesn't respond to my various stimulation methods, just like a goddess who stands high above me, never paying attention to the various ordinary pursuers, I am not without any gains. Howard looked tired but excited. He spoke in a fierce tone, I wanted to use the magnetic constraint to realize nuclear fusion, to release the massive energy from the nuclear fusion reaction of the protium and deuterium contained in seawater under specific environmental and ultra-high temperature conditions. This is the inspiration given to me by the Tesseract. But I soon discovered that the magnetic field that binds the plasma, although not afraid of high temperatures, is very unstable, and plasma loses energy during the heating process. Howard paused, as if thirsty, and poured himself a glass of water. I'm the only one who can't understand what he's saying. Taking advantage of this gap, Captain America, who was standing on the sidelines, spoke up. He was so overwhelmed that he couldn't participate in Howard's endless ramble. What nuclear fusion, magnetic confinement, plasma? It was all a big headache. Luke grimaced and laughed. I've specifically studied it, so I can probably understand what Howard meant. There are two main types of research on controlled thermonuclear fusion: inertial confinement fusion and magnetic confinement fusion. The former uses a high-intensity laser to irradiate deuterium and tritium targets quickly to achieve fusion. The latter uses a strong magnetic field to restrain charged particles, confining deuterium and tritium gas in a special magnetic container and heating it to hundreds of millions of Celsius to realize fusion reaction. Howard's main direction of attack is the second one. His design is somewhat similar to the tokamak device that would appear a few years into the future. It was an experimental program proposed by a Soviet scientist in the 1950s. After decades of work, the feasibility has been proven. He had to give it to him. Iron Man's father's vision and mind are ahead of the times. When did you show up, Rogers? Sorry, I didn't notice you at all just now. Howard waved his hand, completely ignoring the tall, strong pecs of Captain America. When doing research seriously, let alone Rogers' two big chest muscles, he wouldn't divert his attention even if a young girl was standing naked in front of him. The most he would say is, "Don't disturb my research for truth." Where were we? Oh, yes, The controlled fusion project is so massive that we won't be able to get an answer for a while. So, I decided to take the next best thing and do something easier and more challenging. Howard picked up where he left off and continued, and then, there you have it, the first-generation nuclear reactor. Putting it on a submarine would perfectly satisfy Ross Gunn's idea of atomic energy driving the machinery first to propel the ship. You've fixed the most critical core of a nuclear submarine in a few days. Luke patted Howard's shoulder and said with emotion, although you must have heard this many times before, I still have to say, Howard, you are a well-deserved genius. Hearing this compliment from Superman's mouth honestly satisfied my vanity like never before. Howard laughed, then hugged a pile of design drawings and a large stack of draft calculations to Rogers and said, let the mediocre scientists on the Atomic Energy Commission do their research. They can only look up to the glow of knowledge radiating from Howard Stark and I'm going to sleep. Wait, as the first nuclear submarine, don't you want to give it a name? You're perfectly qualified to do so. Luke remembered. Good idea. Let's call it the Nautilus. I like Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and I like Captain Nemo even more. Howard paused and answered. Then he walked into the lounge and slammed the door shut. Before long, the two men standing outside heard snoring. The guy is exhausted. Luke smiled and looked at the model of the nuclear reactor. He couldn't help thinking of Iron Man's arc reactor. It doesn't look too far away. Howard ran to sleep and refreshed himself. Luke packaged and sent the model of the nuclear reactor, as well as the design drawings and calculation drafts, to the Atomic Energy Commission. The guys at the Navy Department will be thrilled when they receive it. Admiral Hyman Rickover of the Bureau of Ships has long proposed that nuclear reactors be placed in submarines. In this way, the huge defect of poor endurance caused by electric propulsion could be avoided. The submarine can also be used as a missile launching pad, making it a deterrent weapon with an extremely important strategic role. The only problem is that there were various technical problems. As a result, this idea could only remain on paper for the time being. Luke knew very well that in 2 years, Admiral Rickover would get consent from the Atomic Energy Commission and the Navy Department. Appointed as the head of the Nuclear Power Department of the Bureau of Ships and the Chief Engineer of Nuclear Submarine Engineering to start constructing nuclear submarines. The appearance of Atlantis, and the presence of Howard, only accelerated this period of history. I hope that Admiral Rickover will make a breakthrough sooner rather than later. Luke thought silently. By developing the technology to build the nuclear submarine, they had the leverage to negotiate with Atlantis. He did have a deliberate intention to indulge in this impending skirmish. The original intention was to increase the significance of S.H.I.E.L.D's voice and its status by taking advantage of Namor's threat and Atlantis' presence. Otherwise, if we want to get rid of the constraints of the Pentagon, we can only wait for the massive invasion of the fleet led by the Kree and the establishment of the World Security Council. That's too slow. Luke thought so. Even the President and the Pentagon treat Superman politely. But being in the center of power, the rules that bind an individual are always objective. Therefore, Luke wanted to take advantage of the emergence of Atlantis, regard this marine civilization as external pressure, and force those who are wary of him to take the initiative to open the heavy shackles on S.H.I.E.L.D. And by the way, let politicians know the necessity of Superman's existence. The next problem to be solved is only the two unstable factors, Namor and Sebastian. Luke thought as he took Rogers into the elevator. Steve, we're fighting side by side this time. The first task is to solve Atlantis. Captain America put on the familiar Stars and Stripes uniform, carrying the vibranium shield that rarely leaves his hand. Luke found that both heroes and villains have strange fetishism. For example, Thor is particularly fond of swinging the hammer, and even though he later had the Stormbreaker, he still loved Mjolnir. Namor, the Sea King, is even more obsessed with the stolen Golden Trident. Like these people above, even after Captain America entered semi-retirement, the vibranium shield was cleaned every day and placed on the bedside while sleeping. When he wakes up early in the morning, he opens his eyes, and just by looking at it, Rogers would feel full of energy and motivation. Atlantis, their king is no match for you. We have the advantage in terms of strength. Rogers sat in the wide-cushioned chair in the director's office and adjusted his posture a bit uncomfortably. This is much more comfortable than the sofa in my own home. Namor Mackenzie is no match for me. Luke nodded and admitted frankly. When you think about it carefully, it seems that Superman had beaten the Sea King in any studio. Even without himself, the big event of the Secret War, Namor will be killed by the other version of Superman, Hyperion, and the Squadron Supreme would destroy the whole country. Compared to now, only to be deprived of the beloved Golden Trident was much better. In the next studio, Superman has made an amazing move of moving Atlantis to the Sahara Desert. If Luke did the same, those blueskins living under the sea would have to go and accompany the Wakanda people. Two countries with the most developed scientific and technological strength, backward systems, and old ideas will one day become neighbors, and some interesting stories should happen. However, this is war. Luke collected his thoughts and said seriously, Namor won't be stupid enough to find me for fighting one-on-one. He has experienced a painful defeat. I believe he has calmed down and stopped holding on to the foolish idea that Atlantis is the first in the world and mutants are invincible. Rogers scratched his head and thought it was reasonable. Atlantis is not Berlin. If Superman directly flew over and hung Namor on a street lamp to end the war. Killing a king will only arouse the hatred of the people at the bottom of the sea, thus expanding the scale of the war. Then what are we going to do? Rogers asked. You will know soon. Luke smiled meaningfully. He prepared a big gift for Sebastian Shaw. Boston Harbor. Silver Fox, wearing a black leather jacket and a pair of short boots, got out of the taxi. She is now a member of Task Force X under the jurisdiction of S.H.I.E.L.D. During this period, the team led by Wolverine and Sabretooth has been running around the world like firefighters. For example, go to Africa to collect a particular kind of metal minerals. Or remove the remnants of Hydra. In a word, Task Force X became S.H.I.E.L.D's sharp blade. And the results were outstanding, much to the satisfaction of the Pentagon generals. You haven't seen me. Now, go back along the same road. After getting out of the car, Silver Fox patted the driver on the shoulder and said so. The middle-aged man with a beer belly suddenly had a blank look in his eyes, as if he was lost in thought. After a few seconds of hesitation, he nodded his head forcefully. After repeating Silver Fox's words, he drove away in his car. He didn't even ask for the fare. Warehouse 4. Silver Fox, who had been manipulating the cab driver's mind, took out a note from her pocket. She followed the address and found the meeting place. You are late. A graceful figure was standing there waiting. Sis, I heard that you became a lackey for humans? It is in your nature to betray your side in exchange for a stable life. Silver Fox frowned and spoke in an unfriendly manner. Emma, you sent me a message to meet me. Is it just to argue? If that's the case, then I can only say that you're still as naive as ever. The graceful figure in the Boston Harbor was none other than the White Queen of the Hellfire Club. She was wrapped in a black waterproof suit, carrying an odd helmet that served as a breathing apparatus, and her hair was wet as if she had just finished swimming or surfing. Haha, I thought you would be more excited and happy to see your sister that you haven't seen in years. The White Queen hugged her arms around her chest. Her voice went cold. Emma, the White Queen, and Silver Fox, her sister, were born in a wealthy family in Boston and grew up with a silver spoon. However, being a young lady of a rich family wouldn't always lead to happiness, at least the White Queen didn't think so. Her father was a ruthless capitalist who never showed much affection for his family. As far as she remembers, the White Queen never went to an amusement park as a child and never received a single compliment. Moreover, the relationship between the parents wasn't good. There were often fights and arguments. Blame each other, find fault with each other, curse each other, it all filled the empty and cold luxury apartment. As we all know, family education will affect a person's character. Emma was rather withdrawn as a child, did not like to talk to others, and had very few friends. If there's one thing worse than having an incompetent father, it has an alcoholic, drug-addicted, cheating mother. Such a bad environment, living in it will only feel depressing. Therefore, Emma, whose heart was closed, awakened her mutant ability very early. Like Professor Baldheaded, she could read the thoughts of people around her, feel their emotions, guide and control them. Moreover, she can also shift into diamond form, making herself dazzling and surprisingly resistant. This was only discovered later. With her telepathy, Emma soon became one of the most popular girls in school. Because everyone who talks to her is amazed at how well she understands them as if they were friends from a lifetime ago. Even the little secrets and hobbies were clear. For Emma, this was a very pleasant and relaxing time. She had more and more friends at school and was deeply loved by teachers and classmates. Her grades were getting better and better, relying on mental ability to cheat. Gradually, Emma created a perfect girl image with excellent academic results. If the story goes on like this, the life of the White Queen would probably become a Mary Sue romance book. Unfortunately, happiness was often short-lived, followed by bad luck. Soon, Emma lost control. A large number of thoughts and emotions poured into her mind, causing her great distress. In addition, the occasional reading of other people's thoughts and entering the consciousness without mastering the strength lead to the target's unconsciousness or disordered thinking, resulting in impairment. With guilt and remorse tormenting her fragile heart, it didn't take long for Emma's life to turn into a mess. After a series of shocks and changes, she chose to leave her family in Boston and started to wander alone. Then, Sebastian Shaw found her and invited her to join the Hellfire Club. "I heard you left that cold place afterward, too?" The corners of the White Queen's mouth tilted up with a slight smile and said, "Tell me, dear sister, how did you feel when you discovered that you could sense the fluctuations of other people's thoughts and read those complex and changing emotions?" Silver Fox was silent for a moment and whispered, "Honestly, it was a terrible experience. It would make you lose faith in human beings, both men and women. I never knew before that Jenny, who often played with me, secretly envied me for having a rich dad, called me a little bitch, and spread rumors that I was having an affair with many boys. I didn't even know that Johnny, who looked so polite and refined, only wanted to get me into bed sooner, full of dirty and disgusting images, and to brag to others that he succeeded." Speaking of the past, Silver Fox looked at her sister, who had left home long ago, and said sincerely, "Emma, I finally understand what you did before. You can tell me. Before becoming a mutant, did you understand the pain?" The White Queen interrupted without courtesy and a cold expression on her face. "Silver Fox is much better than her. It was difficult to control her abilities before. Once she masters them, it would cause big problems. The opponent's ability to tamper with consciousness through contact and psychological suggestion doesn't risk losing control." This is the end of today's episode of Nostalgia. After taking a few deep breaths and getting back to normal, the White Queen turned her head and said, "I invited you here today to inform you to leave S.H.I.E.L.D. as soon as possible. In a week at most, Atlantis will launch a full-scale attack, starting with landing on the Atlantic coast. Superman is really powerful, but he can't stop Atlantis by himself. Those blue-skinned people on the seafloor, with advanced scientific and technological strength, have assembled a terrible army. Anyway, you should quit S.H.I.E.L.D. With a mutant identity, you won't be in any trouble even if Atlantis wins." The young White Queen warned with a serious face. Silver Fox thought about it for a long time and shook her head. The original intention to persuade her sister to give up the darkness and turn to the light had already disappeared. After all, both sides hold different opinions about who was in the right. "Then you're on your own." When the White Queen saw her sister hesitating and didn't answer, she left with these words. She was disappointed and angry with Kayla, Silver Fox, who was a mutant, but she couldn't see the way forward. If Atlantis and mutants joined forces, why would it matter if Superman was strong? A single person wouldn't be able to resist a big tide. 40 minutes later, clicking heels sounded as Carter pushed open the door of the director's office. Silver Fox met her sister. The female agent threw a thick envelope on the table, and a stack of photos slipped out. Although some were vague, you could still see the figure and appearance of two people. Bingo! Luke, leaning back in his seat, snapped his fingers, looked at Rogers, and said, "This is the surprise I was preparing for. Write a confidential report on today's meeting, and then, accidentally, leak it out. Remember to add photos." Carter nodded. When she knew that Kayla, the Silver Fox, and the White Queen were sisters, she asked someone to spy on her. She was prepared to search for the whereabouts of the Hellfire Club, but she didn't expect things to change so quickly. The current situation had risen from the contradiction between human beings and mutants to the small-scale war between the land world and marine civilization. Would Sebastian Shaw believe it? The White Queen, Emma Frost, is an important club member, second only to him. Carter asked hesitantly. What's more, a few photos can't prove anything. It's enough to plant a seed of doubt. Sebastian Shaw's desire for power is extremely strong, and such ambitious people are often very paranoid. Luke tapped the table with his fingers and smiled. As long as he shows suspicion, he will naturally disagree with the White Queen. Through Kayla's persuasion, it may not be impossible to pull the other side into our camp when the time comes. As for whether it would work in the end, it doesn't matter, as long as it could disturb Sebastian Shaw. Carter thought for a moment, seemed to think it made sense, nodded, and said, I'll do it right now. but what would be a more realistic way of leaking? From the list of spies in the FBI, find some Soviet people who have been exposed but haven't been arrested. Since Leviathan and Red Room, both of whom are in contact with Hydra, I believe that they would also keep in touch with Sebastian Shaw. Luke replied without thinking much. The management of S.H.I.E.L.D. should be left to you. Carter smiled. It seems that the Major General was quite proficient in playing with this intelligence counter-tactic. Steve, is there something on my face? Why are you staring? When Carter left the office, Luke found Rogers looking straight at him. Perhaps after losing Bucky, Captain America pinned his feelings on himself. Suddenly, various images kept surfacing in his mind, causing a chill to creep up on Luke's back. You're playing dirty, Rogers lamented. He was as pure as a blank sheet of paper compared to Luke. After having a rather unpleasant conversation with her sister Silver Fox, the White Queen set off for Poseidonia, the capital of Atlantis. As a member of the Hellfire Club, a compatriot of King Namor, she was given a shuttle submarine that only robed nobles could ride and travel freely under the deep sea. As Shaw said, the situation is very tense. When Atlantis and the land world are officially at war and exhaust each other, the mutants will be able to reap the benefits. The shuttle trailed a stream of waves around the dark and complex terrain underwater and arrived at the royal city of Poseidonia over 2 hours later. The White Queen slowed down and was inspected by patrol guards. Through the semicircular window of the cockpit, she saw a large number of marine life gathering to form an orderly and strange team. The King of Atlantis was nominally the ruler of the 4 oceans and the master of the 7 seas. It isn't an exaggeration to say that millions or tens of millions of troops could be assembled with a single command. The land world wasn't united, as an open palm, but Atlantis was like a clenched fist, with all its strength concentrated in one place. The White Queen remembered Sebastian Shaw's words with some deep thoughts. This blue planet, where life is nurtured, has far more oceans than land. The vast bodies of water, which covered about 70% of the Earth's surface area, are home to an untold number of marine life. After Atlantis sank and fell, the population dropped by 2/3, and only after 10,000 years of development did it return to its normal level. Their army wasn't big, and the so-called numerical advantage relied more on harnessing marine life. Living in the deep sea all year allowed Atlanteans to develop the ability to breathe underwater and to see at night. They have a natural affinity to sea creatures and carry an aura of +10 charisma. Those who are gifted will be able to communicate with them, ride with them, become sea knights, and join the King's Guard of Poseidonia. Not only that, but the White Queen also learned that the collapse of Atlantis had left many of the original kingdoms scattered, forming tribal settlements. Such as killer whales, seahorses, and hammerhead sharks, to name a few. These marine tribes, after several battles, now recognize the laws of Atlantis and obey the king's orders. Can one man stand up to a massive attack by a nation's army? The White Queen shook her head. It was because she couldn't see the possibility of the land world winning that she ventured to contact her sister in S.H.I.E.L.D., hoping that the other party would leave the center of the storm. Sebastian Shaw has recently been rallying fellow members of the Hellfire Club, growing at an unprecedented rate. The other side also tried to feed the young mutants, who joined the group, a rather extreme racial narrative. It was almost as if he only changed a few keywords of the Third Reich's theory, then spat them back out. This made the White Queen feel a little worried, as she had disagreed with the extremist acts of racial extermination and genocide. I hope it doesn't come to that. Arriving at the ramp in the western part of Poseidonia, the White Queen put on a strange helmet equipped with a breathing apparatus, opened the hatch, and stepped down. Shaw wants to see you. A young man with dyed red hair whistled as he walked by, wearing a waterproof suit and a breathing apparatus needed by land people. Pyro, a young mutant who can control flames. The White Queen glanced at the other and frowned slightly. Intuition told her that there seemed to be something wrong with the atmosphere. Normally, when they see her, these newcomers would have a respectful attitude. In the Hellfire Club, the core members were named after chess pieces. For example, she is the Queen, and Sebastian Shaw is the King. A brat like Pyro isn't even qualified to be a pawn. How dare he talk to her in that frivolous tone? What is it? The White Queen asked rhetorically. I was out for a spin. I'm a little tired. If it's not something important, we'll talk about it later. I don't know. Shaw asked you to go there as soon as possible, don't keep him waiting. The red-haired kid rookie grinned playfully. The other party's answer made the White Queen even more suspicious. She doesn't have the moral integrity of the bald professor and doesn't mind reading other people's minds and invading their consciousness. Where did Emma go? Everyone stays in Atlantis during this time. Don't run around. Avoid exposing our position. Pyro, you go to the ramp to watch. When Emma comes back, tell her to come and see me. HMPH. She's too reckless sometimes. The White Queen looked back and withdrew from Pyro's mental world. Her intuition told her that there might be an even more serious problem. But by reading through Pyro's thoughts, nothing was found. Forget it, just see Shaw. The White Queen didn't bother to think much about her superior position in the Hellfire Club. Except for Sebastian Shaw, who relied on a metal helmet that shields him from mental attacks and is immune to her powers. Most of the other mutants wouldn't be opponents of her psychic ability. Pyro said you wanted to see me? The White Queen strode into a magnificent and spacious chamber. Namor's trust in Sebastian Shaw grew, and he treated him like a mentor. This made many of the senior leaders of Atlantis unhappy, believing that the king had betrayed his kin and thrown himself into the arms of mutants.